Hello everyone, bonjour. Bienvenue à tous, merci de votre participation. Pour écouter notre webinaire en français, veuillez cliquer en bas d'écran sur l'onglet Interpretation et sélectionner le drapeau français. Merci bien. My name is Paul Curry. I'm the manager of the Urban Systems team at ICLEI Africa. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to day 2 of localizing the SDGs through an urban food lens in the Global South, lessons from the Hungry Cities project. Delighted to see some returners from yesterday's session, as well as some new faces. And I'm sure this is going to be an incredibly insightful session. We are situating this session as part of the 5th Local Climate Solutions for Africa Virtual Congress with a theme of financing for change. But what's exciting about this session is we're broadening the scope to explore lessons throughout the Global South. These are the themes of the LOCS for Africa Virtual Congress, and we're situating food in the relation of nexus and circularity because of how food shares cross-cutting issues. So the key theme of these 2 days is how can food support localizing of the SDGs? And it's convened by the partners shown here. And today's session reflects very strongly on the Hungry Cities Partnership, whose partners are shown here. Joining us throughout the session are participants from Cape Town, Pretoria, Lyon, Mbato, Munich, Honolulu, Mzuzu, Santiago, Johannesburg, Antananarivo, Lagos, Washington, DC, Kampala, Bangalore, London, Glasgow, Toulouse, and more. So to do a brief scene setting from some of the ideas from day 1, we had a provocation from Jonathan Crush that SDG 2 imagines food without people or settlements, while SDG 11 might imagine cities without food. And this session is placing itself in the middle to explore that tension. Further, Edgar provoked us that SDG localization must engage with jobs in the context of automation, inequality, which is our most intractable challenge, the climate emergency, which is changing our current environment and our certainty, our paradigm of certainty. And most importantly, it must explore meaning and the questions of belonging, particularly for youth in an uncertain future. We had closing reflections about what we can take forward into today's session, which say that we must understand the importance of institutions. We must get the relationship between national and local government right across sectors, specifically food. That urban nutrition security is a new concept which isn't yet mainstreamed into the international agenda, so we need more work to get this prioritized. We must improve the room for dialogue between political, technical, and non-technical actors and navigate the tensions and different motivations therein. And our non-negotiable must be ending poverty. And this directly means looking at food security and food systems, which Arama Revi reflects are deeply embedded in our culture. So looking at the socio-cultural aspect of food is very important. So with that brief opening, I'm going to share our list of phenomenal speakers as part of the Hungry Cities Partnership, who are going to explore 3 themes. First, Gareth Haysom will facilitate a discussion of the state of food insecurity and hunger in southern cities, before handing over to Elizabeth Thomas Hope, who is going to reflect on food retail in southern cities, and will then hand over to Zhen Zhong, who will reflect on policy implications. Today's session of inputs for everyone will go till 5 o'clock, at which point we will launch a book entitled The Handbook of Urban Food Security in the Global South, which is edited by Jonathan Crush, Bruce Strain, and Gareth Haysom. So we'll be sharing the bios of our speakers in the chat as we proceed. I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself in the chat as well, share some of the insights from yesterday, some of the questions you may have here. for today, when we focus more strongly on what food can mean for thinking about urban sustainability, sustainability in general, and the SDGs. So with that, I'd like to invite Jonathan Crush to turn on your video, share your screen, and provide some of the further context of today's discussion. Jonathan, you're still muted. There we go.
All right, so you have my screen?
Yes, we have your screen and you're all set.
All right, thanks very much. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, good evening. Just in these few minutes, I'm going to provide, as a way of context for today's discussions, a quick overview of the Hungry Cities Partnership and its aim to build a network for urban food security in the Global South. In terms of an outline, I just want to introduce you to Hungry Cities Partnership, or HCP for short. Outline some quick research themes that have structured our work over the last few years. Turn then to how we actually turn these research findings into actionable knowledge mobilization, and finally some outcomes. The HCP was started by 2014 with a grant from the International Partnerships and Sustainable Societies, IPAS, which is jointly funded by the IDRC and the Canadian SSHRC. And once again, echoing yesterday, our thanks to both of these organizations for their fantastic support of this network. The HCP scales up work that had been done on earlier projects, focused more on African cities for the African Food Security Network, or AFSUN. The idea was to take this work and to scale it up globally. And to do this, we set up a collaborative partnership between All Cities School of Canada and the University of Waterloo in the same town, and partners in 7 and then 8 cities across the Global South. You can see from this map that these are widely dispersed across the globe, and we have representation today from many of these cities taking part in the webinar. Our goals were to research the levels and determinants of food security in these cities and make comparisons, to study the transformation of urban food systems, including their organization structure, with a particular focus on the informal food economy, to assess the opportunities for women and youth to be incorporated into urban food systems as entrepreneurs and employees, to examine the policies that contribute to greater urban food security or might do so, to build the capacity of research organizations and networks linking Canada and various developing countries to conduct collaborative research on urban food systems, and finally to train grad students and postdoctoral researchers to conduct impactful research on urban food security in the Global South. There are 3 main research themes. We'll run through these quickly and draw your attention to various outputs. The first, the mega theme, was the focus on urbanization, poverty, and food insecurity. And the first output is a series of global surveys, and we'll talk about this later today. The output from that is the Elgar Handbook on Urban Food Security in the Global South. Second, we undertook an audit of the food system as a preliminary exercise in all of the cities. And then third, we conducted across the cities representative household food security survey using a standardized survey instrument and metrics for measuring food security across the cities. In total, across the 7 cities, this interviewed over 10,000 and 11,000 households involving about 40,000 household members. There are many findings from this. One which is particularly interesting to draw your attention to is the considerable variability across the different cities that we discovered. If you look at these 7 cities, and at the first column here, the percentage of food secure households varies from a high of 83% in Bangalore to a low of 26% in Kingston, Jamaica. And then if we look, on the other hand, at the final column, severely food insecure, that also shows considerable variation. It's a little less overall, from lows of 2% in Bangalore and Nanjing to over a third in Kingston. Second major research theme was to look at the organizational role of the informal food sector. We undertook surveys of small food enterprises in the 7 cities and surveyed 1,000 food vendors in each city. Second, we looked at the levels and types of youth participation in the urban food economy, given the global youth bulge and rising youth unemployment. And we surveyed 500 youth vendors in each city. And then third, we looked at the regulatory environment governing the food system in each of these cities. The third major research theme was to look at this idea of a supermarket revolution, which had been put forward as a way of trying to explain the transformation of urban food systems. And we were particularly interested in the relationship between supermarkets, informal food vending, and livelihoods. So we mapped the supermarkets and food markets in each city, and you can see an example here from Nanjing in China, which maps the locations of supermarkets and wet markets. We have collated the data from these different surveys, pulling out from the household survey and the informal vendor survey information on supermarkets and supermarket patronage. And then thirdly, interviews with supermarket managers and officials. Having done all of this research, it's a huge body of research with some very large data sets. We then embarked on a knowledge mobilization strategy to disseminate the results of the analysis through a website and social media. You can see 2 links here to our main Hungry Cities website, but also to our social media site run by Bronwyn Dax, which is called Moving on Empty, Facebook and Twitter. We decided, rather than waiting for the slow process of publication through normal academic channels, to institute our own rapid research publication results series. 2 of them are report series, so it's Hungry Cities reports, which are now about 17, and a Hungry Cities discussion paper series, shorter, more targeted reports on research, and we have about 45 of those, and all of these are referenced in your conference pack. So if you're interested in any of this, you can follow up. We've also held an annual research conference to both disseminate results, give a chance for everybody to present their work, but also to network with international and local organizations. In this case, a conference on urbanization, food systems, and sustainability in the Global South, which was held in 2018, here where I am in Waterloo, held in partnership with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. At the local level, we have mobilized the knowledge through city policy forums. And these have taken a different form in different cities depending on local conditions. For example, in the case of Nanjing, it's very much a formal interaction with city officials responsible for different aspects of the food system in the city, including wet market and wholesale market managers. On the other hand, in the case of Mexico City, it has been more appropriate to actually have a policy forum focused on the informal trading, food trading organizations themselves. So there's a workshop, more interactive, involving role playing and so forth. The idea being that in each city there are specific points of intervention and leverage, and that the project needed to be responsive to those. Finally, let me just turn to some outcomes from this process, and today in a way is also a representative of these outcomes. So what we hope we've created is a new body of actionable global, comparative and local knowledge on the interactions between rapid urbanization and food security. We have taken on an advocacy role in terms of trying to advocate for the centering of the urbanization and food security nexus in global governance and development agendas, such as but not confined to the Sustainable Development Agenda and the SDGs. We have created, I think, a sustainable global network and expanded role. We have developed capacity and a profile for this project. And what's been quite interesting is that there have been a number of spin-offs already from this core project. I'll mention some of these quickly here. Consuming Urban Poverty and Nourishing Spaces projects, which are housed at the African Center for Cities. The second project, which comes out of the earlier AFSUN network, called FUEL, which is Food, Urbanization, Environment and Livelihoods, which is looking at secondary cities and food security. This was raised yesterday as an important area of focus going forward. And then finally, in terms of reacting to these strange times, a project which is looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the urban food system in the kind of earliest epicenters of this pandemic in Wuhan and neighboring city Nanjing, China. At the end of the day, what we hope we develop is a set of best practice strategies for helping to mitigate food insecurity, and critically, which is what we've really shown in this work, the huge inequality in access to food, and therefore in food security across these different urban spaces. We've identified these strategies and continue to advocate for their implementation at national and city level. And you'll see from the discussion today, as we draw on the resources from the different cities, how much progress we've actually been able to make in relation to these different outcomes in the different cities. So thank you very much for that chance to give you a rather brief and hurried overview of the Cities Partnership. As I say, there is the resource of the website, which I encourage you to visit after this webinar. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, for the overview and setting the scene. And I think you've articulated really well the breadth of work and the breadth of projects that have emerged from this. My colleague from this partnership, my colleague Ryan has thrown into chat the link to the program packs. If you haven't yet taken a look at that, I really do recommend it, as it has a wealth of studies, reports and links that'll take you to the partnerships outputs. I'd like to now hand over to Gareth Haysom, who will take us through the next dialogue and invite the speakers in his session to turn on their video so we can have a conversational frame. And this is Elizabeth Thomas Hope, Inez Raimundo, and Samuel Orwar. Over to you, Gareth.
Thank you, Paul, and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you, Jonathan, also for that, yeah, as you say, rapid fire introduction to a 7-year project. So in this session, we're going to, for the 3 sessions that we have following from this, we're going to look at specific themes in the different, emerging from the Hungry Cities work. And in this particular theme, we're going to just reflect on the state of food insecurity and allow some of our partners to speak to some of their research findings. As Jonathan mentioned, food insecurity is across the city, there was a wide range of food security outcomes, with Nanjing and Bangalore not measuring that higher levels of food insecure, but for the cities where there was this great challenge of inequality and the tensions that we found, we thought it'd be productive for those cities to reflect on this and just to speak to some of their research findings. So if I can ask, what we are going to do, we've asked each of the city partners just to offer a very brief sort of reflection on that for sort of 5 to 8 minutes. But if we're able to keep to time, and there is some time, if you do have any questions to anyone in the audience, please pose those questions in the Q&A. We might miss them if they're in the chat, and I know there is often a raise your hand option in Zoom, but we might miss that as well. So if you can put them in the Q&A, it is sometimes more productive, and it allows us to look through and see if there are a couple that are similar and combine some of those questions so that those voices get heard. But before we continue, I'd like to really just introduce the panelists. Their CVs are in the resource pack and will be launched into the chats quickly, but shortly. But to introduce Professor Elizabeth Thomas-Hope, who's an emeritus professor at the University of West Indies, and has a really illustrious CV from that, so we'll do that. And Dr. Robert Kinloch, who's a human geographer and a lecturer at the University of West Indies, will also represent some of the work from Kingston, Jamaica. Representing Maputo in Mozambique is Professor Inês Raimundo, who's an associate professor at Eduardo Mondlane University. So boa tarde, Inês, and welcome. And then to Professor Samuel Aoa, who's an associate professor in the Department of Geography at University of Nairobi. And so Elizabeth and Robert, let me hand over to you, and we can continue with the others. And yeah, we look forward to your brief input. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gareth. So I'll just briefly outline some of the food security issues in the context of poverty in Kingston. Progress towards food and nutrition security currently remains uneven in the Caribbean. And although Jamaica has a relatively low incidence of undernutrition, the reduction in the level of undernutrition in the years preceding 2015 was not significant enough for them to meet the MDG target in 2015. Linked to that, obesity due to poor food choices and sedentary lifestyles is one of the most serious nutrition problems in Jamaica and in Kingston as well included. Taking the case of Kingston then, Jamaica's capital city, food access linked to poverty and high food prices is a key food security and nutrition problem. Wide income inequality and high unemployment rates mean that many households in Kingston have a large proportion of the population living below the national poverty line. As a consequence, high food prices are a major problem for the urban poor, and income, we found, to be both a direct and indirect, to have both a direct and indirect association with food security, especially given the minimal availability of social grants. For Kingston, our research in the Hungry Cities program provided household information which allowed calculations of mean income. The high standard deviations indicated significant variability by social groups across the city, with most incomes at the lower end of the range. The lived poverty index was also calculated for each household in the study to provide a broader measure of the experience of poverty, which did not rely on self-reporting of income. So using a composite score comprising several variables, the LPI attempted to capture different dimensions of the experience of poverty based on access to various basic needs. Regarding levels of food security or insecurity, the household survey that we conducted revealed the general situation in some detail using measures of different aspects of food security. Jonathan's slide already demonstrated that in terms of household food insecurity access, the HFIAS scale, we found that although 26% of the Kingston population in the sample were food secure, that means only a quarter of the population were really food secure. 9% mildly food insecure, but 28% moderately food insecure, and 37% severely food insecure. And secondly, we looked at the Household Dietary Diversity Score, HDDS, and this was measured by the number of food groups that were consumed within the 24 hours prior to the survey. Thirdly, a third measure was months of adequate household food provisioning, MAHFP. The MAHFP indicator is a measure of the household's ability to ensure that food is available above a minimum level throughout the year. And then we tried to look at, in the context of what we're speaking about today, the household income and food security status. Food security measures were cross-tabulated with household income, which we found to be more significant than taking the Live Poverty Index. So this was cross-tabulated with household income to show how the financial status of households correlated with food insecurity. The results demonstrated a strong relationship between mean food insecurity scores and household income quintiles. Not surprisingly, the data showed that the lower the income quintile in which a household fell, that is, the poorer it was, the lower was the mean dietary diversity score, indicating that the diet was less diverse in poorer households, and also as it related to household food insecurity access scale, the poorer the household, the higher and the greater the degree of food insecurity. The insecurity access scale score for households in the lowest quintile was 10.6 as compared to only 3.8 for those in the highest income quintile. So in general, households in the lower income quintiles had a correspondingly lower measure for months of adequate household food provisioning as well. So in all aspects of our measures of food security stroke insecurity, income played a very important role. So poverty and the levels of poverty in Kingston are clearly a highly significant factor. I could leave it at that, and perhaps in the discussion we can bring out the possible links to the SDGs, but I would just say in summary that really, and following from what Jonathan had raised yesterday, it's clear that simply SDG 2 on ending hunger and food insecurity is not adequate on its own and has to be integrated with several other SDGs, ending poverty and so on, promoting economic growth, full employment, decent work, etc. And SDG 3, ensuring healthy lives and promoting healthy lifestyles. So these need, as I think yesterday's discussion showed, need to be viewed and focused on at the local level in integrated with each other. So in terms of Kingston, then it needs to be at the local authority, or what we call the Kingston and St. Andrew Corporation, to deal with the SDGs in a combined and integrated way at the level of the city. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you for that, and for putting 3 years of survey into a couple of minutes. So thank you so much. If I can hand over to Inesh now, and Inesh, ask if you can turn on your microphone and your video, and provide some input into Maputo.
Hello, everyone. I would like to start by congratulating the Maputo city dwellers, because today we are celebrating 133 years. And the second thing that I would like to share is the quote of the mayor of Maputo. Since last week, I had the opportunity to present a research result that we did with a colleague from ACC, Dr. Silva Cruz. So he put us this challenge. He said, we are here in the year of 2020, and in 10 years, we have to meet the SDGs. So my question is, do we have enough time to consider these challenges of SDG 1 and SDG 2, considering the setback that was brought by the COVID-19, which has slowed down all effort of governments, and particularly the economy of the country and the economy of the city. In trying to respond to him, I said, Excellence, for a while, we don't have a response to that question. However, talking about these two SDGs, 1 and 2, what I can say is that any plan on food security has to be done aligned with poverty reduction. So now I'm going to talk about the facts. These facts about the food security in Maputo. As a result, on informal food system survey that we did in 2017, the supermarket survey in 2019, and the policy forum that we had here in Maputo in 2020. The fact one is poverty headcount in the city of Maputo. It says that actually only 11% of people are poor. The fact number 2 is food diversity in the last 24 hours, taking in account the system of the food survey of 2007. It says that food diversity is quite slight, but people eat more bread, rice, and other foods made by grains, and less eat in terms of cheese, yogurt, and other milk products. The third fact is where people get the food, and to what extent prices have paid influence on getting food. First of all, people say that informal market is the solution for consumers of Maputo due to the following reasons. The first reason is prices are affordable to all pockets. There is no rigorous working shift and it works. They can borrow food or exchange food with other products. The trade of staple food that are not commonly sold at supermarkets, they can get in informal market. Supermarkets do sell what is not part of their commonly viewed dietary assortment pool of products. So just quoting one of our interviews said buying a smoked goat gravy at the Estrela Vermelha market, which is one of the largest informal market, is not a matter of hygiene, it's a matter of flavor. The fact number 4 is food security in Maputo, likewise in majority of urban areas, depends on import and supply from China, Brazil, and South Africa. Fact number 5, urbanization and poverty forces new ways of getting food. Fact number 6, supermarkets rely on food imports because locally production is impacted by pests, disease, and is not desirable in the eyes of local consumers due to the lack of proper handling and do not have good aspect for consumers. Fact number 7, supermarkets do supply to informal vendors, particularly food that is to expire, lowering the prices at the end of the food chain in lower prices. And fact number 8, there is a long way to curb food insecurity in a city marked by a confluence of interests, municipalities that imposes formal system in a city where the majority depends on the informal. So I also want to call attention to you about the food security policy that we are suggesting based on these 3 studies that I've already mentioned. The first is there is a need for a much permanent dialogue in the city municipality on the consumers' incentives to local production and local consumption, as there are signs of growing local production which are not being consumed. Let me raise a point here. To a certain point, I can say that the COVID is okay, it's a problem, but to some extent has opened the eyes of Maputo local producers, because now, and to consumers, because of the lockdown in South Africa, the first 3 or 4 months, we didn't have alternative unless eating what we are producing here. So maybe you have to think, this is meaning that there are conditions that we can produce and we can consume our local food. Another point is government should invest more on strategies on import reduction by stimulating local production. A dialogue for food policy definition, which vendors like formals and informal, municipal authorities and consumers are urged to respond to the practice surrounding food sales, as selling food is not solely a business selling, but it's also what is sold that is culturally, economically accepted among consumers. Policies to promote the consumption of local produce or existing and widely available food, such as sweet potato. It doesn't make sense importing sweet potato from South Africa because we have conditions to produce it. Manioc, cabbage, mango, banana, pumpkin, beetroot, fish, etc. All of these things, all this kind of food that I mentioned here, we really have conditions to produce. And food policy shall consider that SDG 1 and SDG 2 are 2 faces of the same coin. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Obrigado, Ines. Thank you so much.
Yeah, obrigado.
Obrigado. If I can hand over to Sam, and Sam, if you can maybe provide some your brief the input for Nairobi.
Yeah, thank you, Gareth. I think I'll try to be very brief, right, in order to save on the time. My colleagues have already given some perspectives, right, about what the program was, right, and I think I'll just go to some of the few findings from the city of Nairobi, which has 4.3 million people, which is right about 30% right of the urban population right in Kenya. I must start by saying that most of the food which is consumed in the city comes from other counties, right, as well as food right imports. right? And that particular food, right, is distributed through, right, a number of formal and informal food sources and channels, which are scattered right around the city. One thing we have to note, right, about right, Nairobi, right, is that, right, as much as the supermarket, right, expansion, right, is taking place, which, right, provides food for people usually, right, on a weekly, right, and on a monthly basis for the non-perishable foods, there is an ever, right, increasing sourcing of food from informal sources, right, and as such, right, informal vendors, right, are really playing, right, a key role, right, in the provision of day-to-day foods, right, and especially the perishables which are there. We are also seeing an increasing reliance, right, on food from the rural areas. 46%, right, of the households rely on food transfers from rural, right, areas. And that one gives us a hint about rural-urban links, right, in terms of food, right, provisioning to the urban centers. However, there was much less reliance on food which is produced within the city, right, as less than only 10% of the households engaged in urban farming, which can be questioned much later on. In terms of food access, we can say that 71% of the households are food, right, insecure in various degrees, 25% of them being severely food, right, insecure, which is quite right, a large proportion or, right, a large percentage. 60% of the households go without food, without certain types of foods, right, at also various frequencies because of food prices, right? And now we can find, interplay, right, of affordability of food. Right, a very good case example is that the real food, cereals, which in Kiswahili is ugali, right, is consumed by almost all households. However, 25% of the households indicated that that type of food is usually, right, unaffordable for them, and that is the real food which people consider as food, if I may quote unquote that. On food utilization, we find that almost 12% of the households had very poor dietary diversity, right, of less than 4, right, which means that the composition and number of food groups depends on the household's purchasing power and, again, right, affordability. Lastly, for this, we come to the stability, right, food stability. I can say that about half of the households went for some months without enough to eat, half, right? And we can also note that the female-centered households, right, are doing very poorly, right, in all aspects of food security. Lastly, if I may link all those to SDGs, right, I can agree with my colleagues who have spoken before that SDG number 1, right, on poverty carries the day, because, right, if you link the issues about food availability, food access, food utilization, and food stability, those key, right, variables become worse, right, as income quantiles is lower, which means the poorer you are, the more you are worse, right, in those aspects within the city of, right, Nairobi. And we also have, the interplay of, right, SDG 2, right, on zero hunger, right, SDG 3 on good health and well-being, and the interplay of SDG 12 on food production. Thank you, Gareth. Back to you. I hope I've saved time.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you to all the presenters. There is an opportunity, again, if I can just ask the attendees, if you could please pose whatever questions you might have in the Q&A. There has been one question that came in from Jimmy, and I'm going to hold that question if you don't mind. It was more around the sort of markets and traditional markets in African cities and what those might mean. We're going to, one of our sessions later, will speak specifically, or the next session will speak specifically to our vendor surveys. And I think some of the answers might come up from that. But Marcel Zimmerman asked a question around the role that civil society, or NGOs and faith-based organizations and others, do they actually play a role in food security, if any? And if not, what role should or can they play? And for me, I think this is a really interesting question. And Elizabeth, I might ask you to engage this. I know you played an active role in supporting some of those foundations and other groups that work towards this. But Inesh and Sam, if you can respond to some of those as well. Because I do think this question of food security, and one of this, how this has been framed in this session around the connections between inequality and food insecurity. And I think it almost imposes a responsibility on the state, which is still there, and we need to accept that. But what role can broader societal actors play in responding to this? And again, to make the point, without letting the state and the government off the hook for their responsibility to look after society and their citizens. So yeah, to Elizabeth, and welcome, Robert. It's good to see you there as well. So thank you. So maybe if I can start with Kingston, and then we can move to the other cities, if you can give it a shot. If not, we can pass on to the next respondents.
Who to start?
Elizabeth? Yeah.
Okay,
Sam, you start.
Robert will start.
Yes.
Okay, let's
Hi, good morning, everybody. And thanks, Marcel, for quite an interesting question on the role of NGOs and faith-based organizations. Now, what we have found, well, I think if you think about faith-based organizations in particular, because we have a society that is, largely very Christian society, and normally you'd have in many households at least, one, maybe the matriarch of the household going to church and stuff like that. These faith-based organizations do represent a kind of connection between the individual and they kind of position the individual within this network. And they do provide a lot of social capital for households and by extension for communities, which essentially which does have productive outcomes sometimes. And one of the benefits to this social capital is really the provision of economic resources sometimes, as well as the direct provision of food. Many churches have feeding programs, for example, that they feed the homeless, they feed other members in their church community that might be underprivileged or in need of food, and so in this way they do contribute quite a bit. What we might need to perhaps look at in this kind of discourse on the role of these faith-based organizations is really the extent they might have issues as it relates to reliability, or I don't know how much they contribute as it relates to food stability of food access, and also long-term kind of transformations in enhancing the livelihoods of people who might be depending on these sources. At best, we could probably say that they fill gaps created by the state. In Jamaica, what we found is that the state does not adequately provide in terms of the social benefits, the social safety nets are deficient. And of course, these things are likely to be exacerbated by the COVID-19 circumstances. So I would imagine that the role of these NGOs and the faith-based organizations might be more salient given the newly imposed circumstances. And so
I could just add one thing.
Sorry to interrupt briefly. Sarah, the French is coming through the English channel. Thank you so much. Please proceed.
Yeah, just to add to what Robert has said, which I agree with totally, there's a major NGO, which is a faith-based NGO called Food for the Poor. And they access a lot of basic things, rice, flour, and so forth, and distribute on a fairly systematic basis, usually through the church organizations and others, a number of food items that then the various smaller NGOs and faith-based organizations can distribute, as Robert was saying, to the needy, the poor in the community and so forth. So that's done on a fairly regular and systematic basis. But they have been, in fact, they were represented at our policy forum in Kingston, and they were saying what a struggle it was to keep up with the demand.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. There are some fascinating questions coming through. And so Sam, if I know you said you had some questions relating to that, a response, maybe if you can respond quickly, and then we can try to take one of the other questions.
Yeah, very, very quickly on that. Basically, Nairobi has got NGOs and FBOs who are majorly concerning the feeding programs, but right in schools, right at the low income right neighborhoods, right, and also they go on to facilitate on food production, yeah, within those neighborhoods using right innovative ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. If I can,
Maybe
carry on, Inej.
Sorry. No, I just want to share something about Maputo, what is happening now. Okay, in the past, we used to have this food program in schools, but because Maputo is considered as a privileged city, so now a lot of NGOs and organizations have shifted their attention and paid to other cities or the other areas of Mozambique. But we have this National Institute of Social Security who is in charge of any kind of aid, because in the past, for instance, Muslims, they used to distribute food on Fridays. And we could see a long queues of people queuing in Indian shops, in Muslim shops, just to get either money or a bread. But now the government said, no, this no longer can happen here, because who is in charge of all social security shall be handled by the government. So that's what I can say on that in terms of Maputo.
Thank you, Inej. And one of the questions that came through was just to try and understand, and maybe I can just briefly begin, and if the panelists can just present quite quickly, because you're due to finish in 2 minutes, but the question around the spatial variability of our findings. And I think what the survey did, AFSAN was distinctly pro-poor. What Hungry Cities Partnership has done is try to be as representative as one possibly can across the city scale. And so I think what was discussed by Jonathan and others, Linda, in terms of your question, it was this great variability between the different income groups, where informality demonstrated far higher levels of food insecurity. And one of the things that I think might be worthwhile discussing later when we have our open session is it always about inequality, or is it connected to infrastructure and other questions that also drive higher levels of food insecurity? So our survey was representative across the city as best we can. You sometimes have to pay to get into some communities if they're gatekeepers, so we avoided that from ethical reasons. But across this broad swathe of the city, we did find this great variation across areas, although it wasn't necessarily always just the poorest communities that had the highest levels of food insecurity. But Sam, Inej, and Elizabeth, maybe just to ask, in some of the really informal areas, what were the striking parts and the challenges that you noted in terms of food insecurity? If you can give just maybe a minute response to those, just to respond to Linda Bayer's question. Maybe Elizabeth, do you want to begin, maybe, or Robert?
Yes, Robert is taking it.
You're on mute, Robert.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. All right. So we did notice distinctive patterns as it relates to the spatial variations. In the lowest the low-income communities, which of course also, when you look at their socioeconomic profile, they also fell in the lowest quintiles in terms of the economic. They also had, they had the poorest economic circumstances. We found that food security was particularly severe in those neighborhoods. We found that when you look at the intersections of food security and other aspects of the lived poverty experience, that also was particularly significant. They also had things like higher number of persons per household, more children in the household, and all of these contributed to or compounded the challenges associated with access to food as well as the reliability. The other thing is that in many of these informal settlements, because of the lot sizes, they were they were constrained essentially, and so it limited their engagement in things like urban agriculture.
Thank you.
And so yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Thank you. I think I'm going to maybe end it there and let us move on, just to try and ensure that the other presenters have time. So I just really, before I hand over to Paul, just to say thank you to Elizabeth, Inej, Robert and Samuel. Thank you. And I'm sure we can contribute to the conversations when we open up a little bit later, but thank you very much, everyone. And let me hand back to you, Paul.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gareth, and everyone for delving into some of the concepts underlying food insecurity. I'd like to hand over without ado to Elizabeth, who's going to facilitate our next session, which is going to look at the role of retail. And I'd like to invite Zhenjong and Taiyang, Ganola and Solomon, and Graham to join us in this conversation. Take it away, Elizabeth. You're on mute. Go ahead.
Okay, right. Thank you, Paul. So it's my pleasure to facilitate this session, which is on food retail in southern cities. And we have three interventions or presentations, but actually 5 persons. So I'll introduce first the Mexico City leaders, with Salomon Gonzalez and Guenolo Capron. So thank you for being here, Salomon and Guenolo. It's nice to see you. And I'll pass over to you first to make your presentation.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. We are very happy to be here. Yes, we are going to. Everybody listen to me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
I can hear.
Okay, I go ahead then. Yes, Ganola and me, we have prepared some insights about retail in Mexico City, food retail in Mexico City. Let me give you some brief description about Mexico City. First of all, as you know, Mexico City is part of a large metropolitan area of 23 million inhabitants. We want to highlight the metropolitan dimension of Mexico City, especially in 2 directions. First, the agglomeration is made up of 3 levels of government. As the national capital, there is the federal government, the government of 2 states, and the local government of more than 70 municipalities. This situation, as you can imagine, represents a challenge for metropolitan governance in many aspects of the daily life. Now, let me make 2 points that we have selected to relate the SDGs and the food system of Mexico City. We have identified 2 groups of SDGs those related to food insecurity, and those that are associated with the metropolitan food system, specifically with the selling of food. First, and perhaps the most obvious and direct, are SDG 1 and SDG 3, poverty, reduction, and health. As we have already mentioned for other cities, the food insecurity of households in Mexico City is mainly explained by the socioeconomic conditions of the household. And on the other hand, the low dietary diversity of many households is associated with the problem of obesity and other diseases of the population. In this sense, health authorities have attributed the high death rate of COVID pandemic to characteristics of people associated with poor diet, obesity, diabetes, and hypertension. In fact, 2 months ago, a new federal law established a system of labels on industrialized food with the warning about excess of sugar, sodium, etc. In addition to poverty and health, Mexico City's food system is linked to SDG 11 and SDG 8, cities and work. Household food patterns in Mexico City are largely determined by the metropolitan lifestyles. This lifestyle could be characterized by long trips to go to work or study. In shops, these trips implies a lot of time and great limitations in free time that is reflected in eating out home for millions of people. Sometimes eating out represents eating at the workplace, in schools or universities, or in small neighborhood restaurants, or on the street and sidewalks food stands. The effects of the metropolitations of the food system of Mexico City is manifested in a large supply of food business widely distributed in urban space. This allows us to affirm that the problem of food desertification is not a huge problem in Mexico City, not even for the fresh food that is supplied through street markets. The retail of food in Mexico City, in addition to having good geographical coverage, is characterized by its diversity in terms of type of vendors, size, location, mobility, service, prices, flexibility, etc. But not in food diversity, especially in terms of nutritional products for street sale. Linked to the metropolization of Mexico City, the economy of the labor market reflects well the paradox of having a sector well articulated to the global circuit of the economy and the important informal sector. Finally, we would like to highlight that distribution of retail of food in Mexico City can be explained from the perspective of metropolization. Cities, CDG 11, and labor, CDG 8, with the following 3 contradictory and complementary aspects. Number 1, informality and globalization. Informality derived from ambiguous and sometimes contradictory regulatory system and an economy and institutional framework that is not able to mitigate labor inequalities. And on the other hand, a food distribution and sales system controlled by large supermarket corporations. Number 2, between concentration and dispersion, diversity, increasing concentration on industrial food producers and supermarket chains and global corporations. And on the other hand, we have the dispersion and diversity of a large food sales modalities as street vendors. Finally, number 3, we have between the diversity of food business and the lack of food diversity. typology of food vendors characterized by great diversity and sale modalities, formal, informal, fixed, semi-fixed, or mobile, etc., but which is poor in food diversity. Then I stop here, and that's it what we can at this moment tell about Mexico City and street and food vendor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salomon. And so we'll move on to Nanjing. So I'll ask Zhenzong Si and or Taiyang Zong, are two leaders of the Nanjing project, HEP project, if they would give us their intervention.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. I would like to take a few minutes to reflect on the issue of food security, the hybrid food provisioning system, and the food safety issue in Nanjing. First, I want to say that according to our survey in Nanjing, the city has a relatively higher level of food security, according to the Household Food Insecurity Access Prevalence Indicator. 79% of the surveyed households were considered food secure. Only 2% were severely food insecure. This is the data prior to the pandemic. And after the pandemic, there was a significant increase of food insecurity. We can talk about that later. And 73% of households consumed more than 6 different types of food in one day prior to the survey was conducted. And this demonstrates a relatively high dietary diversity level, indicating a balanced nutrition intake in the city. And we want to argue that the high level of food security is underpinned by a complex urban food provisioning system. This system is constituted by a wide range of food outlets, including several large wholesale markets and over 350 traditional public markets known as wet markets, densely distributed across the city, and hundreds of supermarkets, small food shops, and other informal food vendors. And we found that the traditional public markets, the so-called wet markets, are the major source of fresh produce and meat. And 93% of households bought food from wet markets in the previous year, and about 75% of them shopped there at least 5 times a week. So these markets are the most important avenue for daily food access, daily food access, especially fresh produce and meat. In contrast, we found that supermarkets are the top venue for purchasing staple grains, dairy products, and processed food. So in this sense, the relationship between wet markets and supermarkets is complementary in terms of the kinds of food it provides in these cities. Not only in Nanjing, but actually also according to previous studies in many other Chinese cities as well. These wet markets, or we call traditional public markets, are usually composed of multiple, sometimes more than 100 food vendors competing with each other. They are very much like farmers markets in the Western context, except that these vendors in these markets are mainly resellers. They're not producers. And these markets are also open 7 days a week and year round. These markets are, we want to focus on these markets because they are the most important venue for accessing food in Nanjing. And they are run by both private and public companies with a lot of support from the government. This, we call it this hybrid ownership and management system. We think that they ensure that these markets are competing with each other to avoid monopoly, and so that it can ensure food affordability to some extent, while it also serves public interest. Throughout the decades, the construction of these public markets are considered an essential part of urban planning by the Nanjing government. This is in sharp contrast with cities in the global north, where food is largely absent in urban planning. This is because these public markets are not treated by the Chinese government as profit-driven business, private businesses, but rather viewed as urban infrastructure for public interest, particularly urban food security and public health. And so that's why we've seen multiple regulations being implemented to ensure these markets are densely distributed across residential neighborhoods for accessibility purpose. And I also want to briefly mention that food safety has been a serious concern for Chinese urban residents since the 2000s. More than 2/3 of our surveyed respondents worried about food safety on a daily basis, especially about the chemical residues in vegetables and also other hormone and antibiotic usage in meat. The pandemic heightened people's concern of the safety of food sold in wet markets. However, I would say it is a misconception. Early this year, when we hear a lot of people are calling for a ban of all wet markets in Chinese cities because of the pandemic. It is a misconception that wet markets are selling wild animals, all of them. It's only a few of these markets are selling wild animals. It's not very common for these markets to sell wild animals, so we shouldn't conflict wet markets with wild animal markets. Closing down all wet markets in Chinese cities is impossible, I would say, given its pivotal role in fresh produce supply. It will also be a disaster from the perspective of public health and food security. In fact, with a huge amount of public investment, these markets, because of the pandemic, received much more public support in the past few months to improve their hygienic conditions and also their facilities. In terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, our panelists have highlighted yesterday the necessity of empowering local governments. I think the Nanjing's experience demonstrates what local governments can do to enhance urban food security. Thank you.
Fine. Thank you very much, Zhang. Fascinating contrast with the case of Mexico. And so now we turn to presentation on Cape Town, which will be made by Graham Young.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming today. I will try to keep my remarks relatively brief so we can have time for a discussion at the end. But there are essentially three things that I wanted to say. The first is a point that has been made quite regularly throughout this, this conference, which is that informal economies are, of course, important for promoting food security, but I think it's also important to recognize that they play a crucial role in providing a source of income and employment as well. So when you think about informal economies, you should not only think about them in relation to SDG 2 and SDG 11, but also SDG 1 on no poverty, SDG 10 on reduced inequalities, and in SDG 8 in particular on decent work and economic growth. And I think that the SDGs don't do a particularly good job at integrating informality, but if we want to think about how they could integrate informality more in practice, we really need to think about these questions of governance. Which brings me to my second point, which is about when we think about the governance of informality, I think there are a lot of different things that we can think about and that it's important to sort of take account of. So this includes, what sort of logics are driving governance? Is governance actually focused on promoting development, or is informality governed in a way that is political or sort of tied to rule of law initiatives? Or how does government or governance sort of take place through different political systems? How does it take place through different bureaucratic systems? How does it take place through different legal systems? What are the different sort of institutions that these involves? What are the different incentives? What are the different actors? And are these all sort of coherent and complementary? Does governance actually usually take place within formal institutions? Or is it often done more sort of informally? And finally, it's important to think about not only sort of direct forms of governance of informality, but also sort of more indirect forms as well. And where governance might be absent, where governance might be failed, where governance might be sort of counterproductive, and where governance might be sort of accidental in some ways. And when we think about governance, this is my sort of third and final point, it is extremely important, I think, to prioritize and center the views and needs and perspectives of people who engage in informal economies when thinking about how informal economies should be governed. And I think that Hungry Cities work is particularly important because it provides some quite important insights into how this can be done. And I just wanted to highlight two of these in particular here in Cape Town. The first of these is the fact that the project collected very valuable data on the motivations of food vendors. And I think this is extremely useful for understanding sort of why people get involved in informal food trade. And what we found in Cape Town was that the sort of main reasons that people give was that they needed money to survive, they needed money for family financial security, they had a desire to sort of own their own business, they thought they had the right personality to own their own business, and they were sort of unemployed and unable to find a job. And I think if you take these sort of multiple responses together, you can see that informality, for some it is a choice, and for others it is a necessity. And I think if you recognize this distinction, and obviously it's not a sort of sharp dichotomy, but if you recognize this distinction, then you realize that governance should support informality and should accommodate it and should accommodate people's voices, but it should also address these underlying issues that cause informality, that surround poverty and unemployment and inequality. And the second insight that comes from Hungry Cities surveys that I think is particularly useful here is what challenges informal vendors or food vendors face when they engage in their activities. So again, in Cape Town, 4 stood out. One was too few customers, one was too many competitors, one was suppliers charging too much, and the final one was insufficient sales. And I think if you take these together, they paint a very interesting picture where there are high levels of household food insecurity on the one hand, but on the other hand, there are informal food vendors who are sort of unable to sell the amount of food that they want to sell. And what this suggests is that there is this disconnect between people wanting to buy food and perhaps being unable to purchase that food, and people who want to sell food and not being able to sort of sell it in adequate amounts. So I think when we think about this in the context of governance, this again points to the fact that governance should be more active in addressing these conditions of poverty or unemployment or inequality that both prevent households from buying the food that they need and that prevent retail from being more sustainable. And then we can have conversations about what forms these sort of government interventions should take, if they could be sort of more demand driven than they often are. But I think these are very sort of important things to think about and important conversations to have that quite frankly are often not sort of adequately had when thinking about how informality is governed. So I think I will just end my remarks there. I hope I'm on time. But if you would like to think about any of these things further, then I would point you to paper number 38, discussion paper 38 in the attached resource package for the events. And I look forward to our discussion soon.
Fine, thank you very much, Graham. Right, I'm just looking at questions that have come in. And the first one is for Graham. In your research, did you find vendors that stated they directly work together as a result of lack of government support, almost like a cooperative group? And if so, how did they use their group, that is for group purchasing, operating together in a single area? Can you take that, Graham?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So for the Cape Town research, I mainly worked with sort of existing Hungry Cities data and broader sort of policy and legal analysis. But I know that in general, there is a lot of work on the role that organization can play in informal economies. and whether or not it can be sort of empowering for those involved. I would like to give a sort of optimistic answer about that, and I think that there's significantly potential that it can. There are a few reasons why I would also hesitate to be that optimistic, I suppose. And those reasons surround the fact that organization often reproduces existing inequalities. Organization is often sort of led by and directed in the interest in wealthier vendors, older vendors, male vendors, whatever sort of existing hierarchies and systems of difference that exist within the informal economy, which are usually quite underappreciated, but very, very significant. That these prevent organizations from actually acting in collective interests, and sometimes they provide the opportunity for people to claim to speak on the behalf of others when they don't necessarily speak on their behalf. So I think if we do think about inclusive forms of governance and ways in which the governance of informality can actually be made more inclusive, I suppose, I think it's very important to recognize that these hierarchies within the informal economy exist, and that it is not simply about going to a market and speaking to the leadership of that market, because that leadership quite likely, from my sort of research elsewhere, quite likely, or at least possibly, represents a very specific sort of socioeconomic segment within that market, and does not represent sort of the interests of everybody else involved, even if they sort of claim to speak for them. But anyway, pessimistic part aside, I do think that organization and forms of cooperation are extremely important. But I just think that it is also extremely important to make sure that they are done in a way that is equitable and promotes justice and promotes voice and sort of active engagement.
I wonder if there is another question to Graham, but first I wonder whether for Mexico, Granola and or Solomon may like to address the same issue. Do you have a formal association of informal vendors, for example, in any parts of Mexico City or for the overall city? And how effective are these? Do they fall into the same problems that Graham was mentioning of possibly purporting to speak for all when they're not?
Yes, thank you very much. I don't know if Genola wants to answer. Mais je pourrais, sorry, I can say that, of course, the informal vendors, and it's very important in Mexico City, and history, it's not new. They work from several decades, from several years, and they are very very well organized. Even some deputies, senators from the government of Mexico City and federal government came from this organization. They have a very political force, and they always have a relation, very intention with the local government. Then taking what Graham Young talk about governance, I agree that it's a huge, for Mexico City, is the actor who came from the informal sector have a very important role, very, very important.
I know the situation is different for Nanjing, so I'll just pursue a second question that came to Graham, this one from Linda Bear. I'm wondering if you had any specific findings on the use of food credit with local vendors, and if so, did this change during periods of food price increases? And this may also apply to Mexico City, I think, and possibly Nanjing. So we'll start with Graham.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is a very good question. I've actually been thinking about that, how best to answer that, because I believe that's one of the things that was found in the project, was that this is an important reason why people rely on informal sources for food, because vendors are willing to offer credits much more than the local supermarket might. So I've been wondering where in our many publications we could best sort of point to for that finding. But that is something that is quite sort of prominent in informal food economies, and something that, again, it is a sort of major reason why people are drawn to informal food economies, not just because about access and affordability, but some of these other issues as well that are maybe not thought of as carefully or studied as closely as they deserve to be. I don't know if anyone else on the panel knows of any instances in their cities where that is significant.
I was wondering whether for Nanjing, which is obviously managed, the governance system is very different. Nevertheless, in your markets, wet markets and food markets, is food credit with the vendors possible? Is that common?
I would say it's very uncommon. It's a very different situation there.
Yeah.
People nowadays in markets in Nanjing are using mobile payment, so it's just direct payment with mobile phones.
Yeah, so a very different situation. But I imagine for Mexico City, credit, because in fact the markets in Nanjing are much less an amalgamation of informal vendors and much more formal. But Gwenola, yes, for Mexico?
Maybe I would say that credit is quite common, but in small shops, not on markets, and of course not in supermarkets. But it's very common for poor people in small shops to have credit. And it's a very big support for poor people.
Fine. So there again, a very strong informal sector in Mexico City, and politicized and organized, but with a lot of leeway personally to negotiate prices and things like credit. Now there's another question that's come in from David O'Brien, and he comments on the high levels of food security in Nanjing. And what do the Mexico and Cape Town city teams think about these findings? And what are the key reasons for food security in Bangalore and Nanjing? Do we look at the market for explanations, perhaps? I think it's such a complex, I think they would anybody like to take that? Gwenola?
Yes, we think that the big issue in Mexico City is about the diversity of food. There is a very low diversity of food for poor people and people with food insecurity. Although there is a very big diversity of places to shop and to buy food. In Mexico City, you have 350 markets, like in Nanjing, and you have 1,500 street markets. So the diversity is really the big issue of food insecurity in Mexico City.
Right, so I hope that answers your question, David. How about Cape Town, Graham? Any further comments on that?
Well, I'm going to give quite a controversial answer, I think. So as background, just to let you know, for my sins, I'm a political scientist by training. So that is perhaps where I go to for answers to these types of questions. I think a lot of the reasons might be because of levels of inequality that exist within these cities. And I think that these levels of inequality are often the result of political choices. And I think that inequality may be an active political choice where that inequality is produced by the state, or I think it can be the result of negligence where the state just doesn't sufficiently do anything to address inequality. And I think that informality is a very significant way in which you can understand the way that political decisions are made and the effects that they have. And I think as we sort of framed for this whole event, in I believe Gareth's remarks yesterday, food is a useful lens through which to understand all of these sort of forms of inequality. So if Cape Town does not have levels of food security that are adequate, and if those inadequate levels of food security reflect what is very deep and very profound and very historically rooted levels of inequality that exist within the city, then what does that mean? Where else can we look to for answers for that? And does that not mean that the state, even beyond one's understanding of the role the state should play in addressing inequality wherever it exists, but if the state itself has a significant role in producing or maintaining or neglecting that inequality, does the state then not have an obligation to do more to ensure that that inequality is reduced, or that the effects of that inequality are lessened? I think that's my speech for now.
Thank you, Graham. And I think
I'm also happy to add from the Bangalore context, since
sure.
the question also asked, if there's time, otherwise I'm happy to withhold.
Yes, please, Shreya. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I just wanted to add to what Graham is saying. I mean, I think he's absolutely right in recognizing that the state has a very important role in maintaining inequalities and informality, as well as the state is as active a participant in the production of informality as it is in maintaining inequalities. But in the Bangalore context, where you also have substantial inequality and substantial informality, of course, with very different historical roots than Cape Town or South Africa, we still show up on the survey as being reasonably much more food secure. And I wanted to add that some of this is an artifact of the ability of the questionnaires or the samples to be truly representative of the entire city. And so we, while we've sort of carried out household surveys to the best of our ability, trying to capture a fully representative sample, but the people who are most vulnerable to food security, which are migrants, people living on construction sites, those are often difficult to catch in surveys such as these. And so some of the numbers that we are seeing, we have to remember that some of these could be an artifact of sampling itself. And then I wanted to add another thing about sort of the metric that was used to actually measure food security. And in some cases for us, we found that some of the questions, for example, about anxiety of food access, like are you anxious about where your next meal might come from, didn't translate as well into the local language. And therefore we might have had lower responses than one would normally expect in a city like Bangalore. So, while I do understand that it's important to be able to read these numbers comparatively, we do also have to kind of keep these sampling biases at the back of our mind when we just put the numbers together and read them together.
Thank you very much for that, Shreya. And one, I think, as I said, last question comes back to Cape Town. You referred to the state, Graham, and the question from Marcel Zimmerman is, do you refer to the state at the provincial level or national level, given the limited political role of provinces and their reliance on state funding? My conclusion is that you're referring to the national, is that correct?
Yes, I will try to keep this response short because it could very easily go off for a long time. But so by the states, I mean all sort of relevant political apparatuses that exist within the country. So in the South African context, just very quickly, obviously the national states, both currently and historically, plays a very significant role in the generation and perpetuation and neglect of inequality in these issues. The provincial government does have some powers that are perhaps not being fully used, which I address in my in the paper. There's another plug for it. The paper that I suggested earlier, which was discussion paper 38, which I wrote about Cape Town. And the local state also plays a very important role. And I think all of this gets to the point I was trying to make, which is that, you know, governance takes a lot of forms. Governance is not just the sort of direct policies that exist about informality, that regulate street trading, that demand business, you know, registration and licensing and payment of taxes and all of these things. You know, it is impacted by a lot of different things. It is impacted by macroeconomic policy. It is impacted by how the government tries to address things like policy and employment, and it is addressed by all these other sort of social programs that exist. So I think you cannot develop a full picture of governance, whether it's about food systems or whether it's about informality or whether it's about really any sort of key part of the SDGs to sort of tie it into this more broadly, without considering all of these various ways in which governance takes place, and all of the ways that people or groups or sort of parts of society might be governed in a way that is not only intentional, but maybe unintentional as well. And what does that mean? And what does that mean for sort of promoting inclusive development?
Thank you very much, Graham. And we've now run out of time for this session, but I think what does come out from it is the very important role of the governance factor in retailing and the success of retailing in terms of getting to a wide range of population in each of our cities, and therefore demonstrate or reflected in the levels of food insecurity or security that then are evident. So certainly it's reflecting through our food security measures in all those cities and others that are not in this particular panel, the essential role of good governance. So I thank the panelists very much for that, and thanks also to the persons who sent in their questions, and thanks very much for keeping to time. And so I'll bring this session on retailing to an end and pass over to Paul, who I see is ready and waiting to take the baton. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and what an excellent discussion. Without any ado, I think we'll hand over to Zhenzhong, who will guide us through the next discussion, looking specifically at what the policy implications of some of the Hungry Cities Partnership work is. And for this, we'd like to invite Ndiapo Nicanor, Lawrence Kazembe, Kirtana Jagadish, and Shreya Anand. Please, if you can open your...
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. I think one of the key goals of the Hungry Cities Partnership, as Jonathan mentioned earlier today, is to engage with policymakers by examining policies that contribute to greater urban food security, and also communicate some of our important policy findings. So in this session, we have two groups of researchers sharing their perspectives on the governance of urban food economy with a hope to provide insights on the sustainable development goals. So I would first like to ask Ndiapo Nicanor and Lawrence Kazembe to share your thoughts on the insights into differentiated governance in Windhoek.
Thank you, Zhenzhong. It's afternoon here, so I'll say good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here. Perhaps I should just present a big background from our site in Namibia, Windhoek. And I think I should bring the concept of urbanization, the rapid urbanization here. For a country that gained independence 20 years ago, we have seen a rapid urbanization in Windhoek of about, annual growth rate of Windhoek, which is the capital city, of about 5%. Now, movement was restricted in the country, and we have seen mass movement since independence. Now, looking at that and looking at cities and or urban areas with a particular focus on Windhoek here, and building on the 2008 AFCEN survey, where food insecurity was about 67% for the poor areas. In 2016, where we expanded this to a national or city scale survey, we found that the food insecurity has gone up to 92%. Now, this severity speaks to a number of aspects. And keeping into the context of the informality or the informal food system, I would just like to give a brief to say in 2016, when we did the supermarket survey here in Windhoek, there was a great concentration of South African supermarkets in Namibia and Windhoek in particular, where we had about a total of 158 South African supermarkets present here in Namibia. Certainly this dominance, of supermarkets in Windhoek as the capital city has also replicated itself to some smaller urban areas in the country. We have also seen from the results of some of those surveys that there is kind of like a coexistence between the supermarkets and the informal food sector or the informal food markets. And I think this is what we want to zero into this particular presentation and looking at the policy implications. Now, supermarkets are highly concentrated or dominated the affluent areas, whereas the informal food markets are found within the low income areas. Now, these informal markets are such as the mini markets, the formal open markets, may be regulated by the municipality, street vendors, and so on and so forth. Now, the issue at hand here is to say, in terms of the control of the supermarket or the informal food sector, the informal markets tend to be highly restricted. It faces hostile legislative environment, at times even to, exclusion practices, and at times, violence does occur, and this is really happening to, the informal market, as at times they are in areas that ought to be regulated or is controlled, and there are no amenities at such places. Now, these informal food markets here in Windhoek, they are more or less in two types: those that are controlled by the municipality, managed, and has got amenities, whereas the others are simply open markets. Even within the controlled open markets, at times there are no infrastructures, a question that I will look into later on when we look into the integration or talking into the context of the SDGs. These informal markets, in terms of policy, if I can just then get into, we look in terms of the dietary nutrition, I think, which has been spoken about yesterday, in terms of it being really an interaction of multiple, systems, speaking to infrastructure, cutting across health, poverty, and so forth. food safety in terms of this informal food vending, it's really an important issue. Infrastructure, as I have mentioned, and it's really, as has been said, in terms of looking into the integration of the SDGs and the challenges in terms of the accessibility, the distribution that needs to be looked into here. So I'll perhaps maybe leave Lawrence to touch on aspects that I have left out. Thank you.
Thank you, Ndiapo and Chair. Just to add a few things, Ndiapo mentioned the fact that many of the informal markets are concentrated in the low-income neighborhoods, and essentially what the city has done, they've pursued a policy on what we would call an enclose and contain, in the sense that they've provided about 14 open markets that are managed by the municipality that offer kind of spread out across those areas of low income, and offers a number of food items, and most of them are basically clear marked in terms of what could be sold inside, and as well as, but the much of from our household survey, we found that these particular markets offered a patronage to about 60% of households that are of low income, poverty ranging between 30 to 75%. And much of this food that is bought from these or sourced from these, it's mostly cooked food, as well as fresh produce, like say meat, and then also some traditional foods. They're also part of what is being offered. With regards to food safety, we found that there was no aspect of about food safety. So no proper food handling aspects. We didn't capture any of such, and even so, the food inspection also was not being done regularly or is non-existent. However, as was mentioned, there are some amenities that are available in those, be it water, electricity, which would allow to preserve fresh produce. With the other type of markets, the open areas, these are basically no controls. Anyone can sell anything, and there's no restrictions in terms of time of operation. However, if some of those that are selling their food step out of those areas, then they are kind of contained in a way. So although they are able to sell any type of food, or they can sell within those particular areas, there's no code to guide those particular, and anytime the city can come to disrupt trading in those informal markets that are not managed by the city. So these are some of the things that probably I thought I could add to what Ndiapo covered.
Thank you, Ndiapo and Lawrence, for sharing your insights on the various issues in the policy. in the urban food system governance. And I would like to pass this on to our next presenter, Kirtana and also Shreya, on some reflections on the informality and the food economy in Bangalore, India.
Thank you, Zhenjiang. It's really a pleasure to be part of this event and really just use this moment to reflect on insights from our work as part of Hungry Cities over the last 5 odd years. Of course, it's impossible to, sort of cover all the different threads of work that we've been doing. So for today's talk, I'm really focusing only really on the livelihoods component of our work. So, as we started thinking about the informal food economy in Bangalore, we very quickly realized the limitations of the dominant sort of economic questions that were framing the ideas of informal work, right? These were things like, how do you regulate the employer-employee relationship? How do you secure minimum wages? How do you secure social protection for informal workers? Instead, we quickly realized that the question of place or space, or really struggles over access to workspace, were really essential in understanding the food economy. And then, therefore, the central question became one of planning or governing, or understanding who ultimately decides whether somebody has access to workspace at a particular location or doesn't. So is it the spatial plan that creates vending and no vending zones by land use types? Is it the local official or the local policeman who interprets this plan on the ground? Is it the elite members of a resident welfare association who create narratives around nuisance or hygiene? Or is it all of these? So we realized that the question of governance was really very much at the heart of this. Sorry, could you move to the next slide? Actually, I realized I'm still, yeah. And however, when we actually went about doing our large-scale survey of city vendors, we discovered, contrary to dominant notions that foregrounded questions of harassment or evictions or bribes from local officials, we actually found a substantial presence of long-running, well-established businesses in our sample, businesses that had long relationships with their suppliers as well as with their customers. And we found, across the board that businesses were far more likely to worry about challenges of economic competition than those of harassments or bribes by local officials. And therefore, in response to sort of this very competitive landscape that street vendors face in a context such as Bangalore, social and economic networks become absolutely critical to sustaining their businesses, sustaining and growing their businesses. So economic relationships could include things like paying rent for a part of a pavement, negotiating over access to a street light in a particular location, or they could be social, where you rely on identity-based networks of migration that connect you to rural supply chains, and these other sort of networks in order to secure your access to workspace. But it's important to recognize that these networks act as much to enable these informal businesses to flourish as they do to restrict entry by others and by outsiders. So if we could go to the next slide. As an illustration, this is an image from one of our field sites. This is an agricultural marketing yard. And these women who are shown here, they actually work in some of the large retail stores as cleaners. And then instead of money, their wages are paid in sacks of garlic. And they then set up stalls on the outside of the market, and they peel garlic and sell to retail consumers. And the quote here actually illustrates how sort of associations, these very vulnerable vendors, are also protected from outsiders coming in through these kind of social associational networks as well. And therefore, I mean, this is just one example that I'm using to just highlight how these other circuits of governance then became very visible to us and became very important. And we realized that this is the other sort of space where we really need to interrogate what's going on. And then one final point I wanted to make, which relates to policy, is really about the sheer diversity of businesses that get included in this, big umbrella term called the informal food economy, right? So ranging from these very vulnerable women vendors who are sort of getting paid not in money but in kind, all the way up to stable, multi-generational, quite profitable businesses. We've kind of interviewed the whole spectrum. So if you could go to the next slide, I'll just show you an illustration of one of these businesses, which is being run in quite a prosperous residential neighborhood, and it's run by a father-son duo. And the son, having been educated in computer science and held a fairly sort of what would be considered an upwardly mobile call center job in the Bangalore context, actually left that to come and join his father and kind of expand the family business. And therefore, again, for a further research or a policy agenda, it's very important to unpack these differences within informal food economy, right? So we typically talk about mobile, immobile, but even within mobile vendors, we found that there's a huge amount of difference. So I'll leave it there. I'm happy to sort of speak quite a bit more about this, during the discussion session. And I also did want to add that the results from the survey are up on the HCP website. That's already been shared by Jonathan in the introduction as well as in the conference pack. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kira. Thank you, Shreya. Sorry.
No problem, no problem.
So, Kirtana, do you have anything to add to what Shreya just presented?
I think Kirtana will be available for the Q&A and the discussion session.
Okay, great. Now let's see if we have any questions here. Sorry, I don't see any question in particular from the Q&A box, but I would like to ask one question, perhaps for, let me see. Yeah, perhaps for Windhoek, for the Windhoek team. You mentioned various policy, legislation issue that, for example, legislation that tend to exclude informal vendor practices. Are there any kind of space available from your research for policy engagement to change some of these legislations? Could you elaborate on that briefly? Indiapo or
Benjamin, yes.
Yeah.
Maybe if I may speak to that. Yes, the scenario is quite interesting in terms of policy that guide or regulate, the formal as opposed to the informal markets. Maybe just to inform you that the city of Windhoek signed up, to the Milan Urban Pet Food, and in fact, in our engagement, to them, they have indicated that they have not even moved, in terms of finding out as a city, as a municipal, in terms of the levels of food insecurity. Yes, we are fortunate to have or to be part of the Nourishing Spaces project, where we had an opportunity to engage quite extensively in terms of really governance level on that. And this was done at various formats in terms of workshop or in terms of one-on-one engagement. And we have done so with trying to get really the high level decision makers in several sectors. And I wish to mention that we have done this, together with Jonathan when he was here in Windhoek, and we found very quite interesting, results in terms of policymakers, in as much as we have national frameworks that speaks to the global frameworks. We realize that at local level there is quite disjoint in terms of policies and in terms of governance, whereas another sector, for example the health sector, would have much looked in terms of aspects of nutrition and so on. You would find that the next sector, for example, the trade that is supposed to regulate, food and all these kind of things, have got either not gone into really looking into food, as a regulatory measures. And that speaks to, nutrition, that speaks to, regulating, markets, and the extent of food insecurity in the country, as we are now moving into issues of obesity, non-communicable diseases, and so forth. These are the issues that I think in terms of governance, that there should be a coherence in terms of regulating such, but you find that in terms of local governance, these sectors are quite disjointed.
Thank you for that. We have two questions in the Q&A. So one is about traditional foods. Is traditional foods playing a role in food security, and how we could change mindset towards traditional foods to reduce food insecurity by increasing specifically local food production? Any of our panelists wants to address this question from, based on your experience in your city? Lawrence or Indiapo, do you want to talk about traditional food? Or Shreya?
I mean, I'm happy to, go ahead, Indiapo,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Thank you, Shreya. What we found in our surveys in terms of traditional foods, Windhoek as the capital city has received quite a number of food that you find are produced in the rural areas and now find its ways within, the urban areas. And these type of foods are even sold on the markets. Other than just for simply consumption, coming in as remittances, they have now found their way also in terms of the markets. Recently, we have observed that it's not only within the informal markets, but even with the supermarkets, the formal supermarkets, South African supermarkets, Pick n Pay, we have found traditional, chicken that is now being sold in these supermarkets. So it's quite interesting that even where the traditional food sources production is quite far from the urban areas, this has found, grounds within the cities. Now, in terms of whether this is nutritious, I think it's another concept, that we need to look into, because if this is what people regard or what, as food which they prefer, then I think it also goes back into terms of the concept or the definition of food security. Because if it's being consumed, obviously people must be preferring such food types. But it's in terms of what are the practices, that are out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Shreya, because we only have 2 minutes left, so I would like to ask you to address the second question specifically for you. You mentioned about the wide range of informal economy in the city of Bangalore. And so the question is what it means for policy recommendations.
Absolutely, happy to take that. So, I mean, I think the first thing to recognize is the fact that street vending, because, of its very nature of claiming right to public space, is something that's governed collectively, right? And I kind of just gave you a list of illustrated actors who sort of get involved in regulating, so to speak, street vending. So the first step for policy is to recognize this multiplicity of actors. And in the Indian case, we actually do have, a new policy that's come into place a few years ago, which is quite progressive in its letter, and it recognizes this, and it actually brings in associations of street vendors themselves, local municipal councillors, different sort of layers of government, along with representatives of vendors, into a collaborative governance mechanism. However, the difficulty lies in actually implementing this policy. So for the case of Bangalore, for example, the committee which is supposed to oversee, which has these representatives from different groups, has yet not been constituted. it. So I think the thing is that there are certain sort of, ideas that the policy does recognize the fact that vendors should have a voice in, regulating their own work. So while they sort of recognize this in principle, they are very far from actually being able to do something to implement it. And the second part would be to recognize that, I mean, it's slightly more conceptual point, and I don't have a direct answer for how policy can deal with this, is to really recognize the power dynamics that are inherent in all of these relationships, right? So even if you are able to get a vendor association to the table, that doesn't mean that that vendor association equally represents voices of all, street vendors. And so you are kind of dealing with a very sort of complex and tricky set of phenomenon. Often you have neighborhoods where there are competing claims by different vendors associations to space in the same neighborhood. So I feel like this doesn't have very easy answers for policy, but I think the first step is in conceptually recognizing what's going on and what the different layers are, rather than sort of imagining that, policy can come in and create this kind of level playing field and, manage to sort of make things easy or straightforward for vendors through a policy such as registration or a one-time survey that could regularize vendors. Keertana, do you want to add anything to that?
I think one thing that also, in the policy that Shreya is talking about, it also includes mobile vendors, which were part of our sample. And they made up like almost a significant portion of our sample. And while the Street Vending Act kind of addresses, allocates space to stationary vendors who remain in one kind of a place, but the mobile vendors, like now, they are kind of like, they do need to move around. We had a significant sample that traveled for many hours during a day, for many kilometers. And that would mean that they traverse different kinds of vending spaces. So what happens to them? And that would also mean that not only do they sell in vending spaces, they sell in all kinds of locations, which is that they could be residential places where vendors are not allowed. They could be commercial spaces, they could be office spaces. So governance also needs to take that into consideration, the mobility of vendors and what place then means and what does the public space around them mean in that scenario.
Thank you. Thank you to our four panelists. I think we had some very insightful and intriguing discussion about the policy implications of our studies with the Hungry Cities Partnership. And more information could be found in the attached resource package in the conference program. So I'll hand over to Paul. Thank you.
Thanks, Zhenjiang and everyone in this session. I think that has led us very nicely into a space for open discussion, which Gareth is going to host and guide us through.
So thank you, Paul, and thank you again, everyone. So at this time, I really want to encourage everyone who's participating to ask any particular questions that they might want to ask across a wide range of themes. I think there have been some really interesting questions posed through this process. For me, I was struck, and maybe others can comment on sort of, in the Nanjing case, this mention of infrastructure as public benefit and how that played out. But also Shreya's point that she raised in response to David's question around the sort of invisible urban populace that we don't necessarily see. And some of you might kind of laugh at this, but sort of the Ben Okri, which was part of some of our studies earlier, when I was, early studies around the sort of the notion of invisibility in the urban space, and how there is this group of invisible, and how there is, whilst we're having these conversations, who hasn't been included in this conversation. But yeah, if there are any questions from wider the audience, please do put those into the Q&A, and I will endeavor to get to that. But in response to this, I wanted to try and link back some of these conversations now, and maybe to ask all the cities to really reflect on some of the provocations that we received and that we were given in the discussions yesterday. Particularly, Billy raised this really interesting question on the need to sort of focus across scales. So whilst we're speaking about urban food questions and the SDGs, how do these questions get asked of provincial government? There were questions asked around the different spheres of government here. How do they go to sort of in federal systems, to more state-led governments? How do they go across to the national government, and how do we engage these questions and how do we respond to that? The other question is drawing on Arrow and Eugenie's comments yesterday around the strength of these lobby groups and how these different perspectives sometimes detract from the focus on urban food, and how urban governments and urban spaces, how can they assert this importance of food, and assuming that it is important, in areas that respond to their specific needs in their particular context. So yeah, just some questions to maybe some of the panelists and others who might have some views on this. But if there are any questions, please to join in. And yeah, Katlana, I think you're waiting to pose a question if there's anything from there.
No, I don't think so, Gareth.
Okay, thanks.
My hand for a question.
And I mean, to those that did some work, and I mean, it's from an anonymous attendee who's asked this question, and I don't particularly think it's a controversial question, just in defense of your posing of it. Is there a kind of mafia who is anonymous that is kind of working amongst the informal traders to take control of informality? I think all our cities found some kind of alternative governance regimes. So maybe, yeah, to ask if any of those that did some of the detailed work on informality, if you want to respond to some of those.
I can respond to this. Is there a mafia operating outside amongst informal street vendors? Mm-hmm. So I think in Shreya's, even when she presented, she spoke about social networks and economic networks that create spaces where certain kinds of vendors operate. And it's really interesting that you should say that it's a mafia, because we once interviewed this lemon distributor. So basically, this set of vendors only sold lemons, and they were like, hundreds of them, and it all happened in one place, and all of the vendors came from a single region, which is like a very small town just outside of Bangalore. So he was telling us about how his community, his ethnic community had kind of monopolized the lemon trade from another community that used to run it before. So he was telling us that as a story of how his community from this particular town of this, caste and kind of regional identity were able to take the reins of this lemon distribution, and how that employs now a lot of the young boys who are coming from this town to Bangalore. I guess if you could, it's not a mafia, but it is a certain social network that's operating, and that's probably taking jobs from one kind of community or like regional community or ethnic community, and giving it or like is being taken by another community. I don't know that I would call that mafia, but that is just how these kind of social networks that kind of create jobs, that's how they would create jobs. So that is my that's my input on that.
Can I also come in? I just wanted to add to the question on mafia. I mean, I think, again, I feel like the concepts and the terms that we use are really important. And it's very easy to sort of slip into a language of mafia when we're speaking about, people who are sort of taking control of networks of informal work or different kinds of informal work, but we don't apply the same sort of language to state actors who might be doing pretty much the same thing. And so I feel like just kind of being aware of these concepts and this language when describing certain phenomenon, I think it's important to be careful. And I mean, I have no problem with using the word mafia as long as it's equally applied when it's also about other kinds of powerful actors.
Graham, I see you on there.
Yes, if I could just jump in, if I haven't tired everyone out with my opinions yet. I would just add something quite similar. I think there are two important points to make. The first is that I think it is really important to avoid sort of the language of criminalization when it comes to informality, because that sort of framing is often used for rather coercive tactics by the state, and to delegitimize these activities and to treat them with quite firm repressive responses that really sort of demonize and harm the urban poor. Secondly, I think that at the same time, just to build on that point, I think at the same time, it is important to recognize these sort of hierarchies and power structures that I sort of spoke about earlier within the informal economy that of course also exist in the that also exist in the formal economy, that also exist sort of within the state, that exist in the relationship between the state and the informal economy. But to recognize that this is not a space that is itself free from politics, that it's not a space that is free from its own sort of forms of dispossession and accumulation and sort of political economy considerations, and that there are these sort of competing interests, and there are these sort of forms of voice and silencing, and there are these sort of forms of marginalization that take place within the informal economy, and to recognize that, okay, well, this sort of interaction of capital and labor, if it's that, or around other sort of forms of social capital or whatever it might be, these permeate the informal economy as well. So you can still have these forms of sort of power relations. And I think it's very important to sort of understand those. And again, I don't think that this is something that is sort of adequately done. Too often informality is viewed in a way that is rather undifferentiated and not particularly sophisticated, as something that is just mysterious and can't be figured out in any sort of detailed way. And I think this is something that makes this kind of research particularly important and particularly valuable.
Thank you, Graham. And I think maybe if I just add for a moment to some of the thinking that we've been doing around this, is where policies turn a particular group informal, you also create the space, or through either through oppressive politics, you create the space where they go and seek protection elsewhere, given the essential role that this economy has played in almost all the cities we've worked in around livelihood generation. So there's this, these vendors or just general households face this tension of having to move into informality and engage that. And how do they seek ways to build a level of stability and a level of control in that process? And so I think it is a consequence of that. There were two themes that were discussed through the session. And again, I'm going to just to pose them, is that a number of the respondents, even speaking about sort of the state of food insecurity from our earlier presenters around, from some of the cities, highlighted the role that certain kinds of local production could play. And I'm also mindful that, and I noted a tension that during this research period that we've been engaged in, Jamaica experienced sort of hurricane seasons. We've seen the locusts in sort of really kind of applying sort of real challenges in Kenya and East Africa as a whole. Cape Town went through a savage drought. And in all these instances, localized food systems would have been really under significant stress. So, is this idea of localization and the local food system as being the optimum, is that really the optimum? And does that act in the interests of the most food insecure, who are so exposed to food price changes, etc.? And I would like to just ask, and some of the panelists can perhaps respond, is a broader, diverse food system perhaps more opportune in addressing these food security questions? And what does that mean for how we engage the state at the urban scale around the SDGs, around integrating these various different SDGs? If anyone has wants to respond to that, I can leave it as a rhetorical question if not, but if there is anyone who would like to respond to that, that'd be great.
Hi, Gareth. I can comment on that in the Chinese context. I think this also touches upon your previous question of the issue of scales. I think for the Nanjing experience, it's quite different from other cities and also from many other cities within the country, because Nanjing is a relatively prosperous city located in the economically developed area. So for the national government, I think it's important to recognize the economic variation across the country, especially in many remote and poor areas where market facilities are not that upgraded, and they face various kind of hygienic issue, food safety issue as well. So we've seen, opportunities for the national government to redistribute some of the financial resources to those less developed areas and less developed cities to improve their market facilities for urban food security purpose. And also in the pandemic, we've seen this cross-region coordination taken by the central government to redistribute some of the emergency food storage across provinces to Wuhan, the epicenter, to support the food supply in that city when the city was locked down in January and February. So this kind of initiatives, I think, show how local plus beyond local food practices and initiatives are both important for urban food security. While Nanjing has more than 70% of its vegetable supply produced within the municipality, but a lot of other food, perhaps grains and meat and other fruits might be imported from outside of the city. So we've seen increasingly complex urban food system that depends on food imports from outside the region, and also but the local production really provides a strong support for a stable food supply during emergency circumstances, such as the lockdown during the pandemic. And beyond the local, I think the national food storage and the coordination among different provinces also play a critical role in food security.
If I can, and there are not other questions coming in now, maybe push you a little bit on that, Jinzhong, is just to ask, given the focus that Nanjing as a city had on food and its role in markets, etc., and the crawling peg strategy and everything, so given that they had a better understanding of the state of food insecurity, were they able then, and the state of the food system and how it functioned, were they able to then engage across different governance scales? And I would imagine other cities who had that authority, like Wuhan or others, or was that solely a sort of disaster response strategy, or was there a more sort of integrated governance? And I'm drawing here on Billy's comment on how governance around food and the SDGs has to span these different scales. And so, yeah, trying to tease out what, if Nanjing presents, given that there is a focus on food, do they present some clues as to how other cities might be able to respond to this and how they work across those governance scales?
Yeah, I would say it's very limited, but on one particular example, the Nanjing was one of the first cities in China that actually open up more space for informal food vendors to operate. In China, there has been a lot of conflicts between city bylaw enforcement and also urban informal vendors, and we've also seen all these kind of reports on confiscating equipment from street vendors and chasing them around on the city streets. That happened for years until 2009, when Nanjing government issued a new policy that allows the operation of city vendors, informal food vendors on the street in certain areas of the city. And that quickly picked up by the news media and was reported widely and was highly praised by internet users, and it caught the government's attention, and several other municipal governments followed that route and to provide more space for the informal food vendors. So I think definitely Nanjing could play a more important role in informing other cities to enhance their urban food security. And I think through the Hungry Cities Partnership, we want to see this happen in the future. So we are developing more policy recommendations based on our findings, and we believe these policy recommendations are not only applied to the city of Nanjing, but also to many other large cities in China.
Thank you. Thanks so much. it is interesting, and I think for me what becomes interesting around Nanjing, showing that around China, but also how the emergence of a new form of sort of mobilization that is taking place. So yes, you know, the FAO is through their Food for Cities and other networks within that, UN Habitat, etc., all now beginning to focus on the urban food question. What is also interesting is seeing how in countries themselves where cities can lead even through social media and through those kind of things, but also how groups like the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, how linking into discussions such as C40 and others who have a very specific focus, but bring different groups together to focus perhaps on resilience or others, and how we integrate these different components and the challenges we discussed today into these, I think becomes very interesting. And I think it helps cities start to learn and capacitate from and learn from one another. I know our work has drawn in Cape Town, drew a lot on the sort of earlier work that was done around food policy councils and governing those aspects and what that might have meant at the urban scale. But I think for me, the focus on today and to the audience, I think one of the key issues has been drawing on the new sort of definition that's been proposed by the high-level panel of experts, that food security now sort of expanding the definition to include 6 dimensions. So the conventional, the original dimensions of availability. And I think our work and the discussions we've had today are focused a lot on accessibility, on utilization, and on stability, but running parallel to that work. And we would support this, the suggestion of these 2 other dimensions, one of sustainability, trying to understand the longer term components and how cities start to understand that and rank that or ratchet that up to the SDGs, but then also how agency and voice becomes part of that. So Shreya's point about the invisibility, etc., are all interesting components in that sense. So there are no other comments coming through at the moment or questions. So I'm going to hand back to Paul and maybe just directly on just to ask Edgar Pieterse to close out the session before we go into the launch of the Hungry Cities book just after that, but to a more formal close of the discussion sessions of today. So over to you, Paul and Edgar.
I think Edgar can maybe dive right in, but perhaps the provocation is tying us again more closely to yesterday's conversation on SDGs. Over to you, Edgar.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks, Gareth. So, wow, that was an incredibly rich afternoon, and to be honest, my head is spinning between sort of having to shift not just scales, but also issues, and then of course contextual geographies and the difference that makes. So in the 5 minutes that I have to share some concluding thoughts, they won't in any way attempt to be comprehensive or synthetic. I'll just pick up on sticking with my number 4 of yesterday, pick up on 4 topics that have emerged, and Gareth has of course raised some of them in the beginning. So the first issue, and these are more, I guess, putting on my hat as a chairholder in urban policy and thinking broadly speaking through some of the policy and the research implications of the work. And so the first question that I want to just reflect on very briefly is the slippage that can sometimes enter into the conversation that that poverty is the main driver of food insecurity. So I think we all know that's not the case, but it's maybe worth restating that in most of the geographies, maybe except for China, but for most of the geographies where this project has unfolded and more broadly in the global south, we are facing an acute employment crisis. And this is coupled to an incomes crisis, in part because of the widening of the income spectrum between the top end and the bottom end. And of course, a lot of the people enrolled in the food system through the informal or makeshift economy often and most of the time have to contend with incredibly variable incomes and very low incomes often. But we also know that in some of the upper middle income countries like Mexico, South Africa, and so forth, where you do have a more rounded development agenda to deal with some of the systemic drivers of poverty, particularly investment in education and public health, that the quality of those investments and the differential impacts leave a lot to be desired. And so you do see a significant stunting in social mobility. And so clearly, food insecurity is not just about poverty, but it is about the coming together of a number of very complex variables. Now, I think that coming back to the question of the SDGs, what we need to maybe reflect on in extending the conversation on the drivers of food insecurity is the limits of mainstream development frameworks and how it is so relatively easy for governments to embrace the SDG discourse, but at the end of the day, there's very little shift or altering of macroeconomic orthodoxy. And the way this dissonance is maintained and reproduced and what the power systems is that allows for that, I think is something that we need to reflect on maybe more deeply and see how the research can speak into that question. The second point is on the topic of localization, and Gareth raised this question. And again, I think what has been very significant about this work, of course, is that how important it is that we don't sort of slip into easily digestible rhetoric, such as localization is the answer or localization is the key, but rather to let the evidence speak or to let the evidence lead in some way. And so the understanding that we now have of the nature and the functioning, particularly of informal systems, and within that, the role of different actors, including food vendors and those who are on the production side and feed into that system, and of course the consumption side, are all really, really important to indeed, and I would concur with Gareth here, step away and be able to appreciate the political necessity of a concept like localization, but not to disconnect that from a broader argument about building diverse and, for lack of an alternative term, more resilient or durable systems. And I was particularly struck in this regard by the Nanjing example and the way in which public policy, of course, frames localized production and distribution as a public good. And I guess if there is anything that can potentially be extrapolated and reinterpreted in the other context is that particular issue, because I think it can radically alter the terms of the debate about how does one support and enable localized systems. This then takes me on to the third reflection, and this is whether we shouldn't be a lot more direct and precise about globalized corporate structures within particularly the retail space and what that means for multi-level governance, especially as we see some of the global entities, like we heard yesterday, UNICEF, FAO, and so forth, are all starting to pay attention to this question. And of course, look at global governance structures to intervene and particularly focus on nation states. And this takes me to my final point, which is to really sort of be maybe more sort of propositional about how we can think about the shaping of intergovernmental dynamics, the challenge that Billy laid at our feet yesterday. And yeah, I think it's maybe useful to differentiate at the city scale, and since ultimately this is what this project has been about, is to build a stronger and a clearer and a more evidence-based understanding of urban food systems, but to think institutionally about that. But I think that there seems to me to be at least 4 levels that we need to think about institutional dynamics. And we had a bit of a discussion about the one, which is the organized formations of particularly informal food actors. But yeah, I want to suggest that we go back to maybe some old school development studies, thinking around the importance of democratizing citizen-based associations, whether they're farming associations, vendor associations, precisely because we recognize that these are complex entities and that they mirror the complexity of larger societal structures, and that they are indeed, as Graham has reminded us, riddled with power dynamics and so forth. But the critical policy issue is that there's a responsibility on the state to invest in the capacity development and training and upskilling of democratic grassroots organizations. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to focus on questions of digitalization, building strong and viable social enterprises, understanding nutritional diversity, and the importance, of course, of climate change impacts and so forth that can be fed into these things so that they're both strategic, institutional, but also lays the basis for more effective local political dynamics. The second layer, I would say, at the city level is coalitions, right? How do we think about new coalitions between these kinds of organizations, movements, private sector actors, state regulatory bodies, et cetera, et cetera. And again, here, the kind of work that has been generated in this project can be vital as baseline data to create the foundation for an evidence-based conversation, and to thirdly, instigate a city-level labs where we can really tease out the science policy interface at the urban scale with the right actors, with the decision makers. And then the final dimension of this for me would be mainstreaming this work within municipal government, within city government, so that there's indeed effective enabling infrastructures, that is understood, how something as simple as refrigeration, as appropriate protection services and so forth can all dramatically enhance the productivity and the viability of a lot of these existing systems. And of course, crucially at the end of the day, it's about regulation, 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 and to understand the calibration that has to happen between the regulation of the formal system and the informal system, and how to, in particular, optimize the interfaces between these things, which we now, of course, understand much better than before we embarked on this journey. Now, all of this, of course, has to coagulate so that there can be coalitions to engage national government. There has to be advocacy platforms from the city level upwards to demonstrate how national government is best placed to enable certain environments and possibilities. And this takes me back to the first point, or the second point that I made about, or third point, sorry, about the global corporate structure. And certainly from the African perspective, but if we take a BRICS perspective or Global South perspective, there's a lot to be said about redefining the terms of trade, rethinking the rules of the game in terms of the WTO, especially if there's got to be a degree of food sovereignty as part of both responding to climate change, but also strengthening local systems, as we've heard from the Maputo case. So I will leave it at that as just some provocations and some, for me, fairly exciting and critical policy implications from the discussions over the last 2 days. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Edgar. And I think on behalf of all the conveners, I think we'd just like to extend a huge thank you to our speakers and our attendees for the wealth of insight shared up till now. And without further ado, I think we want to dive straight into a very exciting moment and invite Jonathan, Bruce, and Gareth to share their enthusiasm for the new book that we're going to launch.
If I can, while the others are logging in, if I can just take this moment also just to thank Paul and the ICLEI team for the wonderful support that they've given us through this process, and for ensuring that every presenter was here, was heard, could be seen, etc. So Paul, just a sincere thank you to you as well, and to the rest of your team at ICLEI, and for allowing us to jump onto your platform and do this event in the way it's been run. So thank you very much, Paul. Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks.
Would you like me to share your presentation?
Yeah, please, Paul. All right. This is the final episode in this very interesting 2-day conversation. But we also wanted to use this opportunity to alert participants, not the final, but one of the final outputs from the Hungry Cities Partnership, as currently conceived, which is the ELGA handbook on open food security in the Global South, which I co-edited with colleagues Bruce and Gareth. And the cover came through this week, so it's rather fortuitous. It's not yet published. It will appear in, according to the publishers, in about January of 2021. We're still discussing the question of how big the firewall will be behind which this book rests in terms of access. We hope to make it as accessible as possible. I've got a few slides here, which will just give you some background to the book itself, and then I'll hand over to Bruce and Gareth to have some other editorial reflections on what they see as the relevance and significance of this handbook. Let's start with the cover. We sent the publishers a whole set of potential photographs that we thought that they might choose from our partner cities, and focusing on perhaps some of the more obvious sorts of things that you might expect in a book of this character. For example, urban food markets and vendors, because the cities and supermarkets are increasingly important, supermarkets and so on. But in this collection, we also included, not necessarily by design, almost by default, a photo that slipped in from Oshakati in Namibia, which is actually not one of the formal partners cities in the Hungry Cities Partnership. Now, let me just say something about this photograph, because I think in a way it really illustrates very directly some of the themes that have emerged during the project as a whole. So, and also kind of in a way points the way forward for future work. Now, Oshakati is a secondary city in the north of Namibia. And as Billy Cobbett pointed out yesterday, the greatest volume of this urban transition in the Global South is actually occurring not in the big mega metropolitan areas, but in much smaller secondary cities of sort of less than, say, 200,000 people. Oshakati considerably less than that. And this picture taken by our colleague Maria Salomoni is a formal market which was established and is run by the municipality in Oshakati. And the process of establishing this formal space for food vending also involved prior actions to remove street vendors from a very open and public space into this formally governed market. So these informal street vendors were relocated into this market, which of course then raises the whole issue of related to food system governance at the local level. So that's kind of implicit in this photo. Now the foods you see in the foreground are traditional staple grains. And for me, they symbolize both what we found in our research across many cities is the very heavy reliance on a few small staples, accompanying quite low levels of dietary diversity. But also particularly with secondary cities, the strength of rural-urban links. And the point to emphasize here is that what goes on in the city is not confined to the city. And it's important for us to, moving forward, to actually have a much greater understanding of not simply, quote, urban food systems, but food systems more generally and food supply chains. The central question, I think, raised by this photo is this. I mean, as you can see, the food is there in abundance in the foreground. But right behind it are a series of bowls which are empty. And this raises the obvious question about, well, you may have plentiful food, but is it actually affordable? Is it accessible? Final point I just draw out from this photo, not to overinterpret, concerns the people in this photograph. One of the points that's come across today is that of invisibility and invisible populations. And so I think it's quite interesting here in this photograph to see people are not foregrounded as they are in many publications by international organizations around food security, where one sees smiling smallholder farmers or smiling vendors. This population is pushed to the background and it is invisible. And slightly to the right, you can just about see the arm of the female vendor who actually runs this particular store. So again, sort of pushed to the margins of this photo, and often then pushed to the margins of the governance structures that govern the informal sector. Now, in terms of the, go to the next slide, Paul. This has been an extraordinarily productive partnership. And at its core, in addition to what I mentioned as our kind of rapid results publication outlet, we've also had a whole series of journal special issues and book-length, edited book-length volumes. And this is just a sample of them, either directly by coming out of Hungry Cities events, conferences, and so forth, or taking a slightly broader brush, associated projects. So this is really the last in a series of book publications produced by HCP and its associated and overlapping projects. Now, on the bottom right is the Routledge Handbook of Cities of the Global South, which was published in 2014. It's a landmark book edited by our colleagues Susan Parnell and Sophie Oldfield of the ACC at Cape Town. This is an extraordinarily useful volume. It's got 50 chapters covering every conceivable urban issue and challenge. Now, in that book, there is one chapter which is entitled Approaching Food Security in Cities of the Global South, which was really, as of the beginning of Hungry Cities project, a sort of survey of urban food security in the Global South. And as one might imagine, it's the surveying state of knowledge is quite a short chapter because there wasn't too much around at that point. So this chapter for HCP and became its the first discussion paper we ever published in updated form. And then another recent update really informs the introduction to the handbook. So my point of the Routledge handbook and takes a similarly thematic approach to trying to understand a whole range of issues and challenges around what I referred to yesterday as the remarkable relationship between cities and food in the Global South. Next slide, please. The handbook itself is somewhat less ambitious, doesn't have 50 chapters, but has 19. These chapters, most of them were first presented by invitation at the HCP conference on urbanization, food systems and sustainability in the Global South, which was held in Waterloo at the Balsillie School in 2018, co-hosted Sustainable Development Solutions Network. An important addition to HCP, the Queen Elizabeth Scholars Program, which is an exchange program run by HCP, also largely funded by IDRC, which has seen over 6 countries associated with HCP having the opportunity to build their individual and institutional capacity in the area of food systems research and governance. I mention this because the QES-AS short form program is not only a co-sponsor of this conference, but 5 of the chapters in this book are actually co-authored by former QES scholars. Next slide, please. One always likes to get endorsements of books, and we have 2 endorsements which are reproduced on the cover. One from Professor Bill Adams, who's Professor of Conservation Development at Cambridge University, who writes, "This book challenges conventional thinking about food security as primarily a problem of limited food production. It shows the complexity and interconnectedness of urban food security issues, the power of the globalized industrial food systems that frame the growing food insecurity of cities of the Global South. It shows decisively that tackling urban food security demands moving beyond the search for new green revolutions." And an endorsement also from Professor Bill Mosley, who is director of the program for Food, Agriculture and Society at Macalester College in the US, and also a member of the high-level panel of experts of the World Committee of Food Security, who writes, "With global rates of food insecurity surging, now more than ever, we need to better understand the critical shifts impacting food systems around the world. Handbook explores how and why hunger and malnutrition is on the rise in cities across the Global South. This is a must-read for food security policymakers, scholars, and students." In the, to just say that following the overview introduction, we cover a wide range of topics. There are chapters on food system transformation by James Teft and Marketa Jones-Sova of the World Bank and Cecilia Toccoli, the policy think tank, IIED. Chapters on supermarket revolution and quiet revolution food supply chains by Rina Dasnaya and Tom Reardon. Chapters on rural comparisons and links by Sue Horton, Julio Bird, and Felicity Proctor. Chapter on climate change and urban food planning by Carrie Mitchell and her students at the University of Waterloo. 2 chapters dealing with food and mobility by myself and former postdocs, Edward Chikanda, Godfrey Tawazera, Mary Caesar. We have a pivotal chapter on the urban food security gender nexus by colleague Liam Riley and longtime collaborator of ours, Belinda Dodson. Chapter on urban agriculture by colleagues at FAO and food safety by Zhejiang Sti and his collaborators. And then 2 important concluding sets, really. 2 chapters looking at the appropriateness of northern models of urban food system governance, one by Gareth and another by Vanessa Watson and Jane Battersby. And then the final chapter from the IFPRI, International Food Policy Research Institute, by Marie Rule and colleagues, which lays out an ambitious research and policy agenda going forward, and was actually a keynote address at the conference I referred to. So that's the handbook. It unfortunately is probably going to be priced quite high, but we certainly hope to maximize the accessibility and the impact of this volume. Let me hand over to my co-editors who have to pick up on some of the general themes, which is what thanks to cover. Thanks, Paul.
Hi, everyone. Am I next?
I think so, Bruce. Maybe you go next. And
Sorry, I just missed the intro there. I had everything nicely set up well ahead, and my computer completely crashed on me when I tried to open my video. But anyway, so we're back. Hello, everyone, and really fantastic to be here. Great to see all these familiar names as part of our partnership and people that we've got to know over the last decade or so. I just want to start by actually going back to that photo that's on the front cover of this book. It's quite an interesting one because I have a slide taken in the 1990s, back before the digital camera. And I'm not going to show it to you, but it's of almost the exact same scene that the front of this book has. The difference is not the food that's there, but the apparent wealth of the new market. The old one had a few poles and sticks stuck up with some plastic hanging over and very makeshift, but it was a long market, just like the current one. And I have a photograph of mahangu or millet at the front, some sorghum and beans and so on. There were no bowls in it. And that market was under discussion for formalization by the Oshakati municipality back in the late 1990s. And the general development practitioner approach, the NGOs and all, were, no, you have to just leave it as it is, because we know from around the world that when you build infrastructure, it doesn't get used because we don't understand people's needs, etc. Well, anyway, a new one was built, as you can see, looking just like the old one in the same location, and it apparently works very well. So that's interesting. It's 25 odd years between then and now. But what's noticeable is that the food hasn't changed. So that is quite striking. So it sort of speaks to the persistence of local foods, cultural foods, and the way in which the food economy works at the local level in places like Oshakati. But anyhow, I've been asked to talk a little bit more about the big picture, sort of what it is that drove the Hungry Cities Partnership to do the work that it does. And in fact, AFSUN before that, the African Food Security Urban Network. And I think, we talk a lot about the future demand for food to feed all these billions of people. Now, we understand, of course, that access to food is probably as important as the production of food. But I think what's not often articulated is where these billions will be located. Now, I would argue that spatiality is a profound factor in food and nutrition security across all scales, so from the individual person right up to the global. And that demography is central to understanding the spatiality. Current fertility rates and projections tell us that the demography of the world will be some 11 billion or so people by the end of this century. This is about 4 billion more than we have on our planet today. We also know that about 1 billion of that 4 will be in Asia, but the other 3 billion are going to be in Africa. This is absolutely paramount to understand when we talk about global food security, and particularly when we move to the cities of the global south. Africa is going to be the major challenge. Within this context, though, we also know that unless we meet SDG 1, no poverty, we'd be unlikely to also meet SDG 2, which is zero hunger. So demographics are the one piece of this puzzle, but poverty, and I'm going to speak about urban poverty, is the other piece. Ultimately, when we talk about the future food needs of the planet's population, it's crucial to highlight several factors. I have 4 factors. First, the need for adequate food will continue to be highest from the poorest in the world. Okay? The need for adequate food will continue to be highest from the poorest in the world. Second, Africa will demand the greatest share of all future food to feed the billions yet to come. 3, that with the urban transition underway across the world, the poor and the hungry will be disproportionately in the cities of the global south. And 4, that almost all of the future demand for food in Africa will be from billions living in cities that have yet to be built. Therefore, to meet SDG 2, Zero Hunger, a noble goal, we as a planet facing a pro-poor, pro-urban development challenge like no other, with poverty and food at the center of the challenge. In turn, urban Asia and urban Africa is where the greatest demands for food, nutrition, security will continue to be, together with the urban poor in cities across the world. So this, of course, will be inclusive of many parts of the world, North and South, but I think here particularly of Latin America and the Caribbean, which is now part of our network. With this focus on hunger, I think this book really represents these development challenges that will be with us for decades to come. And I mean this sincerely when I say that I really am honored to be part of the Hungry Cities Partnership and to be able to contribute to shining a spotlight on the critical development challenge of addressing the global south through this publication of our collective efforts. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bruce. I'll chip in from there and I'll be brief. I think for me, this book, what is really interesting about this book is, and I just want to make 3 points and then tie it together with a sort of closing part of that, but I think it sits at a very particular moment in the transition to an urban world, and particularly the southern urban transition, sort of just at the cusp of that. And I know broad generalizations are not necessarily there, but what does this mean in terms of trying to ask questions around the urban food system in the global south as that south is about to sort of transition to being effectively an urban sort of area, which is often not how the global south is understood. And then the second point is to try and, given that transition moment and given that shift in how suddenly cities are starting to understand the need to focus on food, both north and south, but how southern cities are starting to engage this question. If one asks what is the central theme in this book, I would say the central theme is that there isn't a central theme. And I think that adds to the richness of this particular book, is that given that moment of the transition, what this book reflects is these multiple views of what urban food security and the urban food system in the global south actually looks like and what the questions are. So it embraces those multiple views. And I think that is the theme that runs through, is that there are these multiple perspectives that are being presented, different options. And I think that presents, given the contextual nuances that are necessary, given the difference between primary city of 20 million people, as we heard, and a secondary town or city, as some of the contributors speak to in this book, how these different sort of urban actors can respond to that. So I think there are these sort of divergent and contested views around what it might be, and that adds a richness to this book. I think it then feeds into the third point that I want to make, is that when the urban food governance and urban food security questions have been approached in the North, it has been around sort of one of the key components of that is a more pluralistic approach to governance. And so trying to bring in multiple actors that agree on a collective way forward. And I think given the dissonance between the multiple views, what we've seen and what our work reflects and what was evident in the comments and the chats today and yesterday in the sessions is that actually what the South represents is a more agonistic politics around what food security might be and how urban food questions can be addressed. And I don't think we necessarily have the tools to engage in how we convene groups where there are these multiple divergent perspectives. What is the politics of bringing that group together? In our work, having one particular movement sitting with another, they won't come into the same space often because it means that they are going to be effectively tainted by the other. But both have very valuable contributions to make. And so how do we bring these agonistic groups together? And I use that point to kind of wrap this into a kind of conclude it around, yes, this is a book that focuses on the South, but I would like to be quite bold and perhaps I might say a bit pushy to say that I think it's asking questions that haven't necessarily been asked in the North around urban food questions in the North. So here I'll take the work of Jenny Robertson and others that say that there are great lessons to be learned for cities in the north from the work that we are presenting in this book and the questions that are being asked, and how these southern questions might actually provide some really interesting questions, might present opportunities, etc., for a more global kind of perspective of urban food systems governance and urban food security and urban food governance and food systems across cities, both in the north and the south. And so I really do think that the book asks some really interesting questions, and I'll leave it at that and open up to other questions and comments from everyone else. And if anyone wants to ask anything or pose any questions around that. So thank you to Bruce and Jonathan and others as well.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. I'll probably hand back to Paul at this point, because we have actually run out of time. Again, just to echo in closing, thanks to Paul and Italy, to Gareth for all his behind-the-scenes organizing of this, and to our funders, IDRC, who've been here with us on this in this workshop, and also the SSHRC. Back to you, Paul.
Thanks all. What I think we can do is for those who might want to join and ask a question or two about the book, please, if you can raise your hand now, and I'll promote you to panelist, and you can engage directly with our panelists. The official program has concluded, and again, I think we've covered a lot of ground. So I see Linda, I'm going to promote. So if anyone would like to join us in the sort of panelist section, please raise your hand, and I'll add you in. But maybe in the meantime, Linda, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, sorry, I just had to join in there. My name's Linda Bear, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you to ICLEI for the great forum. I'm researching myself on food insecurity in slum settlements, and it's been great to see the work that's gone on, the commitment both from ICLEI, AFSAN, the Hungry Cities Initiative, Nourishing Spaces, and I actually resonate. So I'm probably one of the converted, but I think I would like to push the conversation forward. And I think that Bruce, you actually hinted a little bit at it, but I think that as we see populations transition, as we see the crises that are before us, some of the disparities come even further. And I would say I'm all in and focused on working in slum settlements. I've done that from more of a broader multi-sectoral perspective, but now focused on researching food insecurity in slum environments of Nairobi. And I guess some of the conversations, I agree. I think, Gareth, you highlighted about pushing the dialogue, and I would encourage the dialogue to go on unashamed. I think that we need to push the dialogue. We need to address the disparities, and we need to highlight some of those in conversations, both policy and academic, that are happening. And I think that I would just, I think it's probably a cheer. I'd like to encourage you. I look forward to reading your book. I read the last one, pretty much cover to cover, on food and nutrition in Southern African cities. And I do like the nutrition interface. I do think it takes us into the realm of sustainability and looking at some of the broader SDGs. But I would actually love to hear your thoughts about, you know, particularly a focus on not only urban food insecurity, but a focus on informality in slums. I really am, that is at the heart of what I'm doing, and I think it's come up through my work, both with UNICEF and some of the work that I've done with IDRC. And I would say that we do need to highlight where some of the disparities that are emerging are the greatest, and really talk about that in terms of sustainability and, I would say, resilience. So I'd love to hear any of your comments or feedback. Thank you very much. And I look forward to reading your book.
Maybe if sorry, do you want, I can maybe respond, and if others would like to respond. Bruce, I see you've gone live, so if you want to talk first. Linda did ask. Yeah.
Well, there was an awkward silence, so I thought maybe I'd say something, but please go ahead.
So I think, Linda, maybe just 2 points. And I think just picking up on your informality, and one of the themes that has run through this work, and it was discussed, and Bruce mentioned it, is connecting the food question to space and place. And so we've just done some work recently on what we've called food sensitive urban planning and urban design. And one of the central kind of points that I raised in this question, what prompted it, was to ask the question around, does the street, particularly in informal, does it become both the refrigerator and the kitchen and even the dining place for those living in high levels of informality? And so how does informality and the informal food system connect? And what does this mean for seeing the sort of urban space and using food as a lens to understand other questions? And so that is something that's emerging in our work, and I think it's particularly important. And that adds to the nutrition component, that when that street then becomes both the refrigerator, the kitchen, and the storeroom, and the preparation area and the eating area, what does that mean for the types of foods that are consumed? From a vendor perspective, when there isn't infrastructure, when there isn't supply, they're making highly strategic decisions around the types of food that they'll stock to ensure that they don't lose stock, et cetera, et cetera. So that then also drives wider settlements into foods that have been processed to just last longer. And that is in a way also prompting some of the nutrition transition. So whilst consumers might be well aware of what they should be eating, the ability to access that is being driven by this question of informality in different ways. And these connect to create a sometimes problematic cocktail that we saw during COVID. I'll leave it at that, but maybe, and just to support your comments, yes, and I think we do need to focus on the intersections far more. But back to you, Bruce.
Maybe Sierra can join in with a comment.
I mean, I can.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm not sure if you can hear or see me, but good to see you, Bruce, Jonathan, and the others to hear about your new book. I was wondering if you could share more about the cultural foods that you were referencing in the main image and the cover. Just with urbanization and cities increasingly relying on imported food, the need to make food more available, and then this question of nutrition. I'm curious to know why you think these cultural foods are persistent over the past 25 years, and what do you think the future of those cultural foods are for food security?
Does this fall to me? Because what I can say is that I'm sure, Sierra, you probably have a better answer than I do as to why these things persist. You know, but in terms of a bit of speculation, I mean, I think I'm always impressed generally outside of our academic work on how persistent culture is in humans and in human society. And it's something that we see in all sorts of different ways, even down to the way we reference, you know, Greek mythology, for argument's sake, or other kinds, depending on your culture, other kinds of references that are thousands of years old, and they persist. And part of our cultural sense of who we are and perhaps even well-being is around food. It's focused on food. And so I think, certainly in the case of Namibia, which I know reasonably well, there is no, you haven't had a meal unless you've had a meal that comprises two important things. One is the starch, which is the millet, and the other is the meat or the animal protein. That is a sense of well-being that you get. And, you know, in the past, scarcity was typical. And I think Namibia, rural Namibia, northern Namibia is not that far away from its bigger history in terms of food. And that culture is, 25 years is maybe one generation at the most. And I suspect that the sense of well-being and identity and belonging that comes with food still persists because of that. It's important, but it's also locally produced. There's probably some very strong economics behind it. It's locally produced, it's available, it's relatively cheap. Oshakati is quite far from Windhoek. It's also quite far from Luanda. There's kind of two major sources of food. Most of Namibia's food is imported except in the north. So I suspect all of that probably plays into it. Anyway, I'm now beginning to waffle, so I'm going to stop.
Can we hear from Youngbo?
Yeah, and thank you for your insights. So just to follow on the points brought up by both Linda and Sierra earlier, is that for one, I'd like to preface this comment that like a food issue, as many of these other concerns around sustainability, sustainable development, I find a lot more of a mystery type of a question, a puzzle type, as in you're not necessarily trying to find any more answers at this point, but rather there's so many answers that already exist if you follow development trajectories of a number of other countries. And I often find myself very recently referring quite repeatedly back to the case study of Japan, given 2 generations ago, their situation right after the post-war years, not dissimilar to much of a situation you find in places like Dharavi, Mumbai, Kibera, Kenya, or any of those places today. And actually, a group based in Mumbai called URBZ, URBZ, they actually wrote a series of pieces exploring the parallels with informality and then how that ultimately emerged into something that actually became the underpinning of the broader Japanese economy. And of course, different contexts, but very similar in terms of first principles in how these places developed. So just wondering, have you been probing into what are some of the best practices, so both the good ones, so they could be adapted, and also some of the bad and ugly ones, so we can learn from them what can be mixed and matched from those other cases, say take East, Southeast Asia, and then adapt them to contexts such as places like Lagos, Nairobi, and these areas, given that with the population trajectories, and if things go well with economic growth on the African continent, we may even see the first metropolis in the world that would exceed 50 million, which would be quite unprecedented even by Indian or Japanese standards. So I'd say, what would you suggest, or what are your thoughts about what can we bring from these other regions, a mix and match, so there can be a lot more accelerated learning across these different contexts in terms of not just like food systems, but just urban and socioeconomic infrastructures overall.
Thanks. Can I request Jonathan to reflect on that and close us out for the session?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. It's an interesting question. But of course, what it presumes is that the state, both central and local, is both the primary actor and the primary influencer at the same time. And I think that what we've shown, particularly at the city level, is a kind of morass of bad practices rather than too many examples of good practice. And we see this particularly across the board in relation to the governance of the informal food vending sector. So it's quite interesting to hear from you about that Japanese example and what we see as the centrality of informality, which of course a lot of it takes place outside this so-called governance, set of governance structures in the search for best practices. My point being that vendors work within certain structures and constraints, but they also make their own worlds. And it's really important, and this has certainly emerged in our research across these cities, that the fundamental commitment ought to be towards accommodation and support of these initiatives and these local strategies, rather than attempts to shut them down, to formalize them, to corral them, to enclose them, to criminalize, which is a kind of common feature across many of these cities. And despite all these worst practices, the sector not only survives, but actually thrives and grows, hopefully with the kinds of outcomes you're describing for Japan.
It was just turning attitudes, mainly I see from especially from the higher levels, that many of them treat them with contempt, whereas the key difference were that they were rather supportive, and it's not just property rights in the Japanese example, but occupancy rights as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think this has been an incredibly fulfilling session, and we do encourage the conversation to continue via email and in other channels as well. I know a lot of the outcomes of this conversation will hopefully find their way into the UNEP One Planet Living Sustainable Food System Conference, which is at the end of November. So it seems that we're on the right track with the localization of the SDGs and food conversation. Thank you again to everyone, and please have a great day further.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.